The 18th century dawned upon a European continent fundamentally reshaped by the intellectual tremors of the preceding 100 years. The scientific revolution, with figures like Isaac Newton providing a mechanical and predictable model of the universe, had irrevocably altered the perception of reality itself. This new cosmos, governed by immutable natural laws discoverable through empirical observation and mathematical precision, stood in stark contrast to a world previously explained by divine caprice and scriptural authority. It was this foundational shift that gave birth to the period known as the Enlightenment, a sprawling multinational movement predicated on the supremacy of human reason. Philosophers and thinkers, constituting a vibrant republic of letters that transcended national borders, began to apply the rigorous methods of scientific inquiry to the structures of human society itself. If the heavens operated according to rational principles, they argued, then so too should the institutions that governed human life. This application of reason led to a direct and sustained challenge against the twin pillars of the old order, the absolute monarchy and the established church. The political doctrine of the divine right of kings, which held that a monarch's authority was granted directly by God and was therefore unchallengeable, began to crumble under logical scrutiny. English philosopher John Locke had already articulated a powerful alternative, proposing that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, a social contract designed to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Across the Channel, thinkers like Montesquieu analyzed the separation of powers, suggesting that political authority should be distributed among different branches of government to prevent the emergence of tyranny. These were not mere academic exercises. They were radical propositions that reframed the relationship between the ruler and the ruled, transforming subjects into citizens and positioning the state as a servant of the people rather than its master. Simultaneously, the institutional power of religious dogma faced an equally formidable assault. The Enlightenment was not uniformly atheistic, but it was deeply critical of superstition, clerical privilege, and the use of religion as a tool of social and political control. Voltaire, with his incisive wit, relentlessly attacked the Catholic Church for its intolerance and corruption, championing a rational deism that acknowledged a creator God but rejected miracles, divine revelation, and the intricate rituals of organized worship. This deistic viewpoint became the default position for many intellectuals, who sought a faith compatible with scientific discovery. The monumental effort of Denis Diderot and his fellow contributors to the Encyclopédie served as the ultimate expression of this new climate. It was a systematic attempt to catalogue all human knowledge, placing scientific and technical subjects on an equal footing with theology, and implicitly arguing that all domains of existence were open to human investigation and understanding. This intellectual environment, charged with a profound belief in progress and human perfectibility, created a deep-seated conviction that the ancient structures of European society were irrational obstacles that must be reformed, or if necessary removed, to allow for the dawn of a new enlightened age. While the salons of Paris and the coffee-houses of London buzzed with the revolutionary ideas of the Enlightenment, the electorate of Bavaria remained a quiet bastion of the old world order, a political and intellectual landscape seemingly immune to the currents of change. Governed by the deeply conservative House of Wittelsbach, late 18th century Bavaria was less a participant in the Age of Reason and more a fortress against it. The state was an absolute monarchy in practice as well as theory, with Elector Karl Theodor presiding over a society where feudal privileges remained deeply entrenched and the social hierarchy was rigidly defined. Unlike the more dynamic Protestant states to the north, Bavaria lacked a significant, educated bourgeoisie, the very class that elsewhere was championing reform and challenging the aristocracy. The economy remained overwhelmingly agrarian, tied to ancient obligations and resistant to the commercial innovations that were transforming neighboring territories. This combination of political absolutism and economic stagnation created an atmosphere of profound intellectual inertia, where dissent was not only discouraged but actively suppressed. The dominant force shaping this conservative climate was the overwhelming influence of the Catholic Church, which functioned as a virtual arm of the state. Bavaria was a product of the Counter-Reformation, and its identity was inextricably linked to a fervent, traditionalist Catholicism. For generations, the intellectual and educational life of the electorate had been dominated by the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits controlled the universities, censored publications, and served as confessors and advisors in the highest courts of power. Even after their official papal suppression in 1773, their institutional legacy and conservative ideology continued to permeate every level of Bavarian society through the ex-Jesuits, who still held key academic and administrative posts. Public life was saturated with Baroque piety, from elaborate religious processions to the widespread veneration of relics, practices that Enlightenment thinkers viewed as the epitome of irrational superstition. This pervasive clerical power ensured that state policy aligned with orthodox dogma, creating a unified front against the introduction of secular rationalist ideas. Censorship was the primary tool used to maintain this intellectual isolation. A comprehensive index of forbidden books was strictly enforced, making the works of Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and other leading Enlightenment figures illegal and dangerous to possess. Government and ecclesiastical censors worked in tandem to scrutinize all imported materials and domestic publications, purging any hint of unorthodox thought. The universities, particularly the prestigious University of Ingolstadt, where the Illuminati would be born, were not centers of free inquiry, but factories of conformity. The curriculum was dominated by scholastic theology and canon law, with professors required to take oaths of loyalty to the church and state. Any deviation from this prescribed orthodoxy could result in immediate dismissal and social ruin. It was precisely this suffocating environment, this lack of public space for debate, and the impossibility of open intellectual opposition that created the fertile ground for a secret society. Because reform could not be advocated in the open, it had to be planned in the shadows. The very intensity of Bavaria's repression did not extinguish the desire for change. It merely forced it underground, breeding a radicalism that was a direct and equal reaction to the extreme conservatism it sought to overthrow. Adam Weishaupt's revolutionary vision was not born of a singular inspiration, but was a meticulous synthesis of the most radical philosophical currents flowing through Europe. As a professor of canon law, he possessed a unique, sanctioned access to the very texts that were forbidden to the general Bavarian populace, allowing him to construct a blueprint for his secret order from the most potent and dangerous ideas of his time. The framework for his new society drew heavily from the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose writings provided the theoretical basis for a complete reimagining of human nature and governance. Rousseau's concept of the natural man, an individual inherently good but corrupted by the artificial constructs of civilization, particularly private property, social hierarchy, and institutional religion, became a cornerstone of Illuminati doctrine. Weishaupt adopted this idea that humanity could be guided back to a state of natural virtue, but only after the corrupting influences of throne and altar were systematically dismantled. Furthermore, Rousseau's treatise on education, Emile, which advocated for shielding a child from societal dogma to allow for the organic development of reason, provided a direct model for the Illuminati's own hierarchical system. Initiates were to be methodically re-educated, slowly shedding the prejudices of their upbringing to achieve a state of pure, unadulterated reason. While Rousseau provided the utopian destination, it was Voltaire who supplied the militant energy and the immediate target. More than any other figure, Voltaire weaponized the critique against clerical power. His famous exhortation, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamous thing, was a direct call to arms against the institutional power of the Catholic Church, which he saw as the primary engine of superstition, intolerance, and intellectual oppression. Weishaupt embraced this anti-clerical zeal as a central, non-negotiable tenet of his order. The Illuminati were to be the secret soldiers in this war against the infamous thing, working from within to undermine the Church's authority and replace religious dogma with a morality based entirely on reason. This was not simply a theoretical position, but a practical program of action, directly inspired by Voltaire's lifelong campaign against religious fanaticism and his defense of a rational, deistic worldview that stripped away the need for priests, popes, and sacred texts. Beyond these two giants, Weishaupt's philosophy was hardened by the even more radical atheism and materialism emanating from the Parisian salon of Baron d'Holbach. Thinkers like de Holbach and Denis Diderot went further than Voltaire, rejecting not just the church, but the very idea of a deity, arguing for a purely materialistic universe in which human morality was a matter of social science, not divine command. While the lower degrees of the Illuminati maintained a deistic facade to attract a wider membership, evidence from the order's captured documents suggests its innermost secrets held a vision for a world entirely free from spiritual authority, a direct echo of de Holbach's circle. Weishaupt's unique genius was not in originating these ideas, but in weaving them together into a coherent, actionable, and secret program. He took Rousseau's vision of a perfected humanity, fused it with Voltaire's militant anti-clericalism, and grounded it in a materialist rejection of superstition, creating the potent ideological fuel for an order designed to remake the world from the shadows. The pivotal event that transformed the abstract desire for reform in Bavaria into a concrete opportunity for clandestine action occurred in 1773. In that year, Pope Clement XIV, bowing to immense political pressure from the Bourbon monarchies of France, Spain, and Portugal, issued the papal bull Dominus ac Redemptor, officially suppressing the Society of Jesus throughout Christendom. This was a political earthquake. For over 2 centuries, the Jesuits had been the most influential, wealthy, and intellectually formidable order within the Catholic Church, serving as educators to the elite, confessors to kings, and the papacy's most disciplined agents. Their sudden dissolution created an enormous power vacuum across Catholic Europe, but nowhere was the impact more profound than at the University of Ingolstadt. For nearly 200 years, the university had been a Jesuit fortress, the intellectual heart of the Counter-Reformation in Germany, where the order held a virtual monopoly on the most prestigious professorial chairs and dictated the entirety of the curriculum. The papal decree instantly shattered this institutional dominance, throwing the university into a state of unprecedented chaos and opportunity. Into this void stepped Adam Weishaupt. Though himself educated by the Jesuits, he had developed a deep and personal animosity toward their dogmatic control and what he perceived as their stifling effect on free inquiry. The suppression of the order was his moment. In 1773, at the age of just 25, he was appointed professor of canon law at Ingolstadt, a position of immense prestige that, for the preceding 90 years, had been held exclusively by a member of the Society of Jesus. His appointment as a lay, non-clerical academic to such a post was a radical break from tradition and a clear signal that the old order was fracturing. This was followed 2 years later by his elevation to Dean of the Law Faculty, further cementing his position within the university's changing power structure. He used his new platform to introduce lectures based on empirical observation and rationalist philosophy, directly challenging the scholastic methods that had long been the university's unquestioned foundation. However, the fall of the Jesuits did not mean the immediate triumph of the Enlightenment in Ingolstadt. The ex-Jesuits and their powerful conservative allies within the Bavarian court and clergy did not simply vanish. They regrouped and waged a bitter campaign of intrigue against the reform-minded professors who had taken their places. Weishaupt found himself a primary target of this reaction. He was publicly slandered, his lectures were monitored for heresy, and his professional advancement was constantly obstructed by a network of determined traditionalists. This experience was formative. Weishaupt quickly concluded that open reform was impossible in such a hostile environment. The entrenched opposition was too powerful and too insidious to be confronted directly. If the ideals of the Enlightenment were to take root in Bavaria, it would not be through public debate or university curriculum changes, but through a secret, disciplined organization capable of fighting the forces of superstition and tyranny on their own terms. The Illuminati was conceived not as a philosophical debating society, but as a necessary instrument in a covert war for the soul of Bavaria, a direct response to the power vacuum and the vicious conservative backlash that followed the Jesuit suppression. Adam Weishaupt did not conjure the structure of his order from nothing. Instead, he acted as a discerning architect, studying the blueprints of existing secret societies that had already proven remarkably successful and resilient. The most significant of these templates was Freemasonry, which by the late 18th century had established a vast and influential network of lodges across Europe. Weishaupt observed in Freemasonry a brilliant organizational model, a ready-made system for recruitment, indoctrination, and clandestine communication. The Masonic structure of progressive degrees from the entered apprentice to the master mason provided a perfect mechanism for slowly revealing a hidden doctrine. A candidate's loyalty and discretion could be tested at each stage before they were entrusted with more sensitive truths, a system of gradual enlightenment that Weishaupt would later adopt and radicalize for his own purposes. Furthermore, the Masonic Lodge offered a private, protected space where men of influence could gather to discuss philosophical and political ideas, operating as a parallel civil society beyond the immediate reach of state censors and clerical spies. This framework of secrecy, ritual, and hierarchical progression was the ideal vessel into which Weishaupt could pour his own, far more subversive, political agenda. While Freemasonry provided the practical, structural model, the mystical allure of other traditions offered a powerful psychological tool. Weishaupt was acutely aware of the appeal of Rosicrucianism and other Hermetic fraternities, which captivated the European imagination with promises of ancient secret wisdom. These groups, often more legendary than real, claimed to possess esoteric knowledge passed down from antiquity, covering subjects from alchemy and the transmutation of metals to the achievement of spiritual perfection. While Weishaupt himself was a staunch rationalist with a deep contempt for such mysticism, he was also a pragmatist who understood its power as a recruitment magnet. He recognized that the promise of initiation into profound, world-altering secrets was a more potent draw than a simple invitation to a philosophical reading group. He therefore decided to incorporate a facade of mystery into his order's outer degrees, using symbolic language and elaborate rituals to create an atmosphere of ancient profundity that would attract and retain members who might otherwise be hesitant to join a purely political organization. The Illuminati was thus conceived as a strategic hybrid, designed to improve upon the models of its predecessors. Weishaupt sought to combine the widespread, effective structure of Freemasonry with the seductive promise of hidden knowledge found in more mystical orders. However, he intended to strip these elements of their original purpose. The Masonic framework would not be used for mere self-improvement or social networking, but as the chassis for a revolutionary machine. The mystical symbolism would not lead to genuine spiritual enlightenment, but would serve as a carefully constructed veil, concealing a core doctrine that was purely secular, materialist, and dedicated to a concrete political goal: the complete overthrow of existing civil and religious authority. In Weishaupt's design, the Illuminati would be a more disciplined, more focused, and ultimately more dangerous organization than any secret society that had come before it. The architect of the Bavarian Illuminati was forged in a crucible of intellectual conflict and personal ambition. Born in Ingolstadt in 1748, Johann Adam Weishaupt was an orphan from a young age, a circumstance that placed him under the guardianship of a figure who would decisively shape his destiny: Baron Johann Adam von Eichstätt. Eichstätt was a prominent curator of the University of Ingolstadt and a leading proponent of Enlightenment thought within the deeply conservative electorate. He granted his godson unrestricted access to his extensive private library, a collection filled with the works of French philosophies and other radical thinkers whose writings were officially forbidden and fiercely suppressed in Bavaria. This early clandestine education created a profound duality in Weishaupt's mind. While he was formally schooled within the rigid Jesuit-controlled system at Ingolstadt, His private intellectual life was a world of forbidden reason, empirical science, and biting critiques of clerical authority. He became a man with two distinct identities: the public academic navigating a dogmatic world, and the private revolutionary consuming the ideas that promised to tear that world down. This internal conflict intensified during his academic career. Weishaupt was a brilliant student, and by 1768, he had earned his doctorate in law. His rise through the university ranks was meteoric, a testament to his intellect and ambition. His entire professional life, however, was defined by his complex relationship with the Society of Jesus. He was a product of their educational system, mastering their methods of logic and rhetoric, yet he grew to despise what he saw as their intellectual tyranny and their use of education as a tool for social and political control. He developed a personal and professional resentment for the order, viewing them as the master puppeteers of Bavarian society and the chief obstacle to the progress of reason. This animosity was not abstract. It was a daily reality. Even after their official suppression, the ex-Jesuits and their allies remained a powerful force at the university, working tirelessly to undermine Weishaupt and other reform-minded academics. His position as a professor of canon law placed him at the very nexus of ecclesiastical and state power, giving him an intimate, expert-level understanding of the legal machinery that upheld the authority of the Church. He saw firsthand how doctrine was codified into law, how superstition was institutionalized, and how the power of the state was used to enforce religious dogma. This unique vantage point fueled his frustration to a breaking point. He was an Enlightenment rationalist, trapped inside the very engine of the old regime, teaching the legal framework of a system he believed was fundamentally unjust and intellectually bankrupt. His revolutionary ambitions were therefore not the daydreams of a distant philosopher, but the calculated response of an insider. He concluded that the forces of tradition were too deeply entrenched to be defeated by open debate or gradual reform. The only viable path forward was to create a secret, highly disciplined organization that could operate in the shadows, using the Jesuits' own methods of covert influence and indoctrination against them to finally bring the light of reason to Bavaria. At the heart of Adam Weishaupt's project lay a philosophy so radical it made the moderate reforms of mainstream Enlightenment thinkers seem timid by comparison. Before adopting the more resonant name Illuminati, the organization was known by a title that perfectly encapsulated its core belief: the Order of Perfectibilists. This term, perfectibility, was central to Weishaupt's vision, but he interpreted it in a far more absolute sense than contemporaries like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. For Weishaupt, the perfectibility of humanity was not merely a potential for gradual improvement, but a tangible, achievable end state. He posited that human beings, once stripped of the corrupting influences of their environment, were capable of reaching a state of such high moral and intellectual development that they would become entirely self-governing. In this perfected condition, the external constraints of the state, its laws, its courts, its monarchs, and the dogmatic authority of the Church would become entirely superfluous. Humanity, guided solely by reason, would achieve a form of enlightened anarchy, a global community of free and equal individuals living in harmony without the need for princes or priests. This utopian destination was the Order's ultimate and most secret goal, a truth revealed only to those who ascended to its highest echelons. The entire structure of the Illuminati was designed as an elaborate pedagogical machine to bring this vision to fruition. It was, in essence, a clandestine university for the moral re-education of society's most influential men. Weishaupt's method was one of systematic deconstruction. He believed that every individual was born pure, but was immediately shackled by the prejudices instilled by family, church, and state. The primary task of the order was to meticulously identify and eradicate these prejudices, a category that included patriotism, religious dogma, dynastic loyalty, and even the traditional family structure. Through a carefully managed curriculum of prescribed readings, written self-assessments, and supervised reflection, Each member was guided to shed the layers of their socially constructed identity and replace it with a purely cosmopolitan and rationalist worldview. Their loyalty was to be systematically transferred from their king and country to the order and its universalist mission for humanity. This process was intensely psychological. Members were required to compile detailed reports on their own character, weaknesses, and innermost thoughts, which were then analyzed by their superiors. This system of surveillance and mutual scrutiny, inspired by Jesuit methods, was intended to accelerate the members' journey toward rational self-mastery. The ultimate aim was to create a new kind of man, an enlightened agent who saw himself not as a Bavarian or a Catholic, but as a member of a single human species, destined for a higher state of existence. Weishaupt's vision was, therefore, profoundly revolutionary. He was not seeking to reform the monarchy or liberalize the church. He was planning their obsolescence. The Illuminati were to be the secret vanguard, a disciplined cadre of perfected individuals who would discreetly occupy positions of power and influence, and from within, gently and invisibly guide society toward a future where the old structures of authority would simply wither away, no longer necessary for a species that had finally learned to govern itself through reason alone. The abstract vision of a perfected humanity required a concrete beginning, a moment of transition from philosophical treatise to functioning organization. That moment arrived on the 1st of May, 1776. The date was deliberately chosen, coinciding with Walpurgisnacht, a night steeped in folklore and superstition, a symbolic irony that would not have been lost on Adam Weishaupt. Under the cover of darkness, he led a small group of his most trusted pupils from the University of Ingolstadt into a nearby forest. This clandestine gathering was not for ceremony, but for insulation from the ever-watchful agents of the Bavarian state and the residual power of the clerical establishment. The initial cohort was exceptionally small, comprising Weishaupt and just 4 other individuals, primarily his students of law. These young men, including Anton von Massenhausen and Franz Xaver von Zwack, had been carefully selected for their intellect, their disillusionment with the status quo, and their personal loyalty to their professor. They represented the first seeds from which a global revolution was intended to grow. In this secluded setting, Weishaupt laid out the foundational statutes of his new society, which he had been drafting for years. The first and most absolute principle was an oath of profound secrecy. Members swore to suffer any penalty, including death, rather than betray the order's existence or its secrets. This was not a mere formality. It was the essential survival mechanism for an organization whose ultimate goals were fundamentally treasonous. He then outlined the initial rudimentary structure. Each new member would be personally mentored and scrutinized by the one who recruited them, creating a cellular system designed to prevent any single member from knowing the full extent of the organization. This compartmentalization was a key innovation, ensuring that the capture or betrayal of one individual could not compromise the entire network. He established the practice of adopting classical pseudonyms, or noms de guerre, to further obscure identities and foster a sense of detachment from their public lives. Weishaupt himself became Spartacus, a name that unequivocally signaled his revolutionary intent. On that night, the organization was formally christened the Covenant of Perfectibilists. Weishaupt explained to his first initiates the core, albeit simplified, objective: to cultivate and perfect their own reason, freeing themselves from the bondage of prejudice and superstition. He presented the order as an elite academy of the mind, a secret school for developing moral and intellectual autonomy. The more radical, long-term political goals, the abolition of monarchy, religion, and private property, were kept hidden, reserved for a higher grade of initiation that did not yet exist. The 4 students who took the oath that night did so believing they were joining a society dedicated to personal enlightenment and the quiet, scholarly pursuit of virtue. They were unaware that they had just become the first officers in a clandestine army, the charter members of an organization designed not merely to study the world, but to methodically and covertly dismantle it. Adam Weishaupt constructed his order not as a fraternal club, but as a meticulously designed machine for psychological and ideological transformation. Drawing inspiration from the hierarchical models of both the Freemasons and his Jesuit adversaries, he engineered a graded system that ensured absolute secrecy and progressively deeper indoctrination. In its initial form, this structure consisted of 3 distinct classes, each serving a specific function in the recruitment and molding of a new kind of rationalist agent. The first stage, the grade of novice, was a prolonged period of probation and intense scrutiny. Upon entry, the candidate took a preliminary oath of silence and was kept in deliberate isolation, knowing only the identity of his recruiter. His primary task was not to learn the order's secrets, but to reveal his own. He was instructed to produce a comprehensive written report detailing every aspect of his life, his family history, his social connections, his personal ambitions, his weaknesses, and a list of his friends and enemies with an analysis of their characters. This dossier, unknown to the novice, was sent up a chain of command to unseen superiors, who used it to assess his suitability and to gather intelligence on potential future recruits. After successfully completing this rigorous period of self-analysis and observation, which could last up to 2 years, the novice was deemed ready for advancement to the second grade, Minival. The name was a direct reference to Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom, and the initiation marked the candidate's formal acceptance into the order's School of Reason. As a Minival, the member was finally allowed to attend meetings, known as Minival assemblies. These were not social gatherings but structured academic forums where members, under the guidance of a superior, debated philosophical questions and presented research on assigned topics. The curriculum was carefully controlled, designed to systematically erode the members' reliance on religious dogma and political tradition, and replace it with the order's brand of radical rationalism. The oath taken at this stage was far more binding than the first, demanding eternal silence, unshaken loyalty, and submission to the order. The third and final of the initial grades was that of Illuminated Minival. This rank was reserved for those Minivals who had demonstrated exceptional commitment and an aptitude for the order's philosophical worldview. An Illuminated Minival was entrusted with greater responsibility, most significantly the task of supervising and directing the Minival assemblies. They became the junior officers of the order, responsible for guiding the intellectual development of the lower ranks and identifying promising candidates for future advancement. They were also trained in the arts of recruitment and subtle influence, learning how to discreetly steer conversations and plant ideas without revealing their affiliation. The vows required at this level were even more stringent, cementing the members' obedience to unknown superiors whose commands were to be followed without question. This 3-tiered structure was a brilliant system of control. It ensured that the most radical and sensitive secrets of the order were protected by multiple layers of initiation, while simultaneously creating a self-perpetuating mechanism for indoctrination, where the pupils of one grade became the teachers of the next, all marching in lockstep toward a final objective they could not yet fully comprehend. For an organization with treasonous ambitions operating within a tightly controlled police state, security was not a matter of ceremony, but of survival. Adam Weishaupt, acutely aware of the risks, implemented a multi-layered system of concealment designed to protect the order's members and its mission from discovery. The most fundamental of these measures was the mandatory adoption of classical pseudonyms, a practice that served both practical and psychological purposes. This was not a mere affectation, it was a tool for systematically severing a member's connection to their public identity. Upon initiation, each brother abandoned his given name in favor of a nom de guerre, drawn from Greek, Roman, or sometimes Egyptian antiquity. Weishaupt himself became Spartacus, the leader of the slave rebellion against Rome, an unambiguous declaration of his ultimate intent. His closest lieutenants adopted equally symbolic titles. The lawyer Franz Xaver von Zwack became Cato, the Stoic Roman Republican. while Anton von Massenhausen took the name Ajax, the formidable Greek warrior. This practice created an immediate operational buffer. In correspondence, members could discuss each other's actions without using real names, making intercepted letters difficult to decipher and protecting the identities of their comrades. To secure this correspondence, Weishaupt developed a sophisticated system of cryptography. The primary method was a complex substitution cipher, often referred to as the hieroglyphic cipher, where numbers and symbols replaced letters. For instance, the number 1 might represent G, 2 could be HA, and so on. But the system was far from a simple one-to-one substitution. Often the numbers were arranged in a grid, and their position within it corresponded to a letter, a method that made frequency analysis more difficult for any would-be decryptor. The complexity increased for higher-level communications with different grades using distinct keys. This cryptographic discipline extended to all aspects of the order's internal records. Dates were obscured using a new calendar that renamed the months. January became Dianius, February became Apollonius, and the year was calculated from the Persian king Yazdegerd's accession in 632 AD, a deliberately obscure starting point. This coded language also applied to geography. Every significant location was assigned a secret name to mask the order's expansion. Bavaria was referred to as Achaia, Austria became Egypt, and Munich, the heart of the electorate's power, was codenamed Athens. The order's home base, the University of Ingolstadt, was known as Ephesus. This web of aliases, ciphers, and codenames created a completely insulated internal world. A captured letter would be almost unintelligible to an outsider, reading as a nonsensical discussion between historical figures about events in ancient Greece, dated according to an unknown calendar. This system was the critical armor that allowed the Illuminati to operate and grow under the very noses of the authorities they sought to overthrow, creating a clandestine reality parallel to the one their enemies inhabited. The engine of the Illuminati's intellectual project was the Minival Assembly, a forum that functioned less as a fraternal lodge and more as a clandestine university seminar for radical thought. Within these carefully managed meetings, the process of enlightenment was not a mystical revelation, but a rigorous methodical training in empirical observation and critical analysis. Each Minival was tasked with becoming a secret archivist of the human condition, a student whose laboratory was society itself. A central tool in this education was the Quibus Licet, a curated reading list of texts that were either banned by the state or considered morally corrosive by the Church. This curriculum included the works of radical French materialists like Helvetius and D'Holbach, political theorists such as Montesquieu, and critiques of religion that were unavailable in any public university. By studying these forbidden books, members were systematically desensitized to traditional authority and armed with the most advanced critiques of the existing order. This theoretical education was paired with an intensely practical regimen of secret reporting. Each month, every Minival was required to submit detailed written analyses on a range of subjects. These were not mere academic essays, they were intelligence reports. A member might be tasked with creating a psychological profile of a local cleric, analyzing the financial weaknesses of a noble family, or mapping the social networks within a government bureau. This practice, known as insinuation, trained members to observe the world with a detached, analytical gaze, to see individuals not as souls to be saved, but as systems of passions, interests, and vulnerabilities to be understood, and eventually manipulated. The Order's superiors compiled these reports, creating an ever-expanding secret encyclopedia of Bavarian society, a detailed map of its power structures and pressure points. The process was self-reinforcing and created a system of mutual surveillance. Members were encouraged to report not only on outsiders but on the character and progress of their fellow brothers, ensuring that ideological purity and commitment were constantly monitored. The goal was to cultivate a specific type of mind, one that was liberated from all preconceived notions, that trusted only its own powers of reason, and that saw the world as a set of problems to be solved through logic and strategic action. This educational system was designed to strip away the ingrained deference to throne and altar, and to replace it with a cold, calculating understanding of human mechanics. It was a process intended to produce not just philosophers, but a new class of enlightened agents, equipped with the intellectual tools and the secret knowledge necessary to diagnose the sickness of society and, in time, to administer the cure. The Illuminati's system of observation was not merely directed outward at the state and church. Its most intense and psychologically potent gaze was turned inward. Weishaupt engineered a sophisticated web of internal surveillance that transformed every member into both a subject and an agent of constant scrutiny. This was not a casual system of gossip, but a formalized bureaucratic process of mutual espionage designed to enforce loyalty and identify deviation. The primary instrument of this network was the Tagebuch, or journal, which every member was required to keep. In it, he was to record his own progress in the order's teachings, but more importantly, to document his observations of his brothers. These were not simple reports on attendance or participation in debates. Members were instructed to analyze the character, temperament, strengths, and ideological vulnerabilities of their peers. Every conversation was a potential data point, every expressed doubt a matter for the record. This raw intelligence was then collated and processed through another layer of the system. Each local group was overseen by a superior who maintained a control book or control book. This ledger contained a detailed profile of every member under his supervision, synthesized from the monthly reports he received from his subordinates. The superior's task was to create a comprehensive psychological dossier, noting who was ambitious, who was prone to vanity, who possessed financial difficulties, and who might harbor lingering religious sentiments. This information was power. It allowed the leadership to tailor assignments to a member's specific personality, to exploit his weaknesses to ensure his loyalty, or to isolate him if he showed signs of becoming a liability. The process created an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia. A member could never be certain if a friendly conversation was a genuine exchange or a test of his ideological purity, with his words being noted for a future report. This constant pressure to conform was a powerful tool for indoctrination. It discouraged independent thought that strayed from the approved curriculum and rewarded those who most convincingly adopted the order's rationalist worldview. The system also served as a brutally effective quality control mechanism. Superiors used the collected data to identify the most zealous and capable members for promotion to the higher, secret grades of the order. While those deemed unreliable or ideologically weak were held back, their progress stalled indefinitely, without explanation. Weishaupt's design created a perfect feedback loop of control. The superiors directed the observation, the members observed each other, and the resulting intelligence flowed back to the leadership, allowing them to refine their control over the entire organism. It was a panopticon of the mind, ensuring that even in secret, no member was ever truly alone. Adam Weishaupt's revolutionary project was never intended to be a mass movement. He harbored a profound disdain for popular uprisings, viewing them as chaotic, violent, and ultimately ineffective. His strategy was one of quiet, systemic infiltration, a revolution to be conducted not in the streets but in the council chambers, lecture halls, and salons of the powerful. Consequently, the Illuminati's recruitment process was a highly selective and targeted operation, aimed exclusively at co-opting the existing elite. The ideal candidate, the perfect Illuminatus, was not a disenfranchised peasant, but a man of influence, education, and position, someone who already held a lever of power within the very system the order sought to dismantle. The primary targets were men who could enact change from within. Government officials were of paramount importance. A court councillor, a treasury administrator, or a senior magistrate could subtly influence policy, divert funds, access state secrets, most crucially, recommend other sympathetic individuals for key appointments, creating a silent network of influence within the state bureaucracy. Academics and educators formed another critical recruitment pool. As a university professor, Weishaupt understood that controlling the minds of the next generation was the surest path to long-term societal transformation. He targeted fellow professors, tutors to noble families, and school administrators who could subtly introduce enlightened and anti-clerical ideas into their curricula, shaping the worldview of future leaders before they ever assumed power. This intellectual fifth column was essential for preparing the ground for a more rational and secular state. The order also actively sought out members of the aristocracy. While many nobles were conservative defenders of the status quo, Weishaupt identified a subset of enlightened aristocrats who were frustrated by the limitations of absolute monarchy and drawn to the ideals of reason and reform. Figures like Baron von Knigge were invaluable. They brought not only immense social prestige and access to the highest circles of court life, but also provided the financial resources necessary to fund the order's expanding operations. Finally, the Illuminati targeted the shapers of public opinion, prominent writers, publishers, and librarians. These men controlled the flow of information and could help popularize the philosophical tenets of the Enlightenment, weakening the intellectual foundations of the old regime. The profile of a potential recruit was therefore clear. He had to be under 30 years old to ensure he was malleable and free from deeply ingrained prejudices. He needed wealth, to be independent of the need for state or church patronage, and he had to be well regarded in his profession. Most importantly, he had to possess a demonstrable dissatisfaction with the world as it was, a quiet ambition, and an intellectual hunger that the order could harness for its own purposes. This was not a call to arms for the masses. It was a curated invitation to the powerful, a strategy to turn the pillars of the establishment into the agents of its own quiet demolition. The Bavarian Illuminati's ambitious project of intellectual and social transformation was sustained not by abstract ideals alone, but by a pragmatic and carefully structured financial system. To operate in secrecy, fund its expansion, and support its members, the order required a consistent flow of capital, managed with the same discretion that characterized all of its activities. The economic engine of the society was multi-layered, drawing resources primarily from the very elite circles it sought to influence. The foundational revenue stream came from initiation fees, a standard practice borrowed from Masonic lodges but adapted for the Illuminati's specific needs. Upon entry into the novice class, and for each subsequent advancement through the grades, a member was required to pay a set fee. This sum, which could be substantial, served a dual purpose. It immediately capitalized the local chapter's treasury and acted as a filter, ensuring that recruits possessed a certain level of financial stability, which Weishaupt deemed essential for a member's independence and reliability. Beyond the initial payments, a system of regular dues provided a steady and predictable income. Each member contributed to the order's coffers on an annual or semi-annual basis, creating a reliable budget for operational expenses. These funds were managed by a designated chapter official, the quaestor, who was responsible for maintaining meticulous, albeit coded, financial records. The money was used to cover the costs of the order's material needs: the printing of instructional texts, the acquisition of forbidden books for the quibus licet, the purchase of chemical reagents for creating invisible ink, and the general administrative costs of a growing clandestine network. This regular income ensured that the order's day-to-day operations were not wholly dependent on the whims of its wealthiest patrons. However, the most significant contributions came from these powerful patrons themselves. The recruitment of figures such as Baron Adolf von Knigge and the wealthy diplomat Franz Xaver von Zwack brought not just influence and connections, but substantial financial infusions. These donations, often far exceeding the standard dues, enabled the order to undertake more ambitious projects. They financed the travel expenses of insinuating brethren sent to establish new chapters in other German states, supported members who might have fallen into financial hardship as a result of their clandestine activities, and provided the capital needed to discreetly purchase influence where it could not be gained through persuasion alone. This financial structure made the Illuminati entirely self-sufficient, a crucial trait for a secret society aiming to undermine the established powers of church and state. It was an economy of revolution, fueled by the surplus wealth of the very aristocracy it intended to render obsolete. For 4 years, Adam Weishaupt's order had remained a small, intellectually intense, but geographically contained entity, a circle of academics and officials largely confined to Bavaria. Its growth was slow, hampered by its founder's suspicious nature and a rigid, unappealing structure. The society was a revolutionary engine without an effective transmission. That changed definitively in 1780, with the initiation of a man whose organizational talent and social connections would prove to be the catalyst for the order's explosive expansion. Baron Adolf von Knigge, a North German diplomat, writer, and, most importantly, a high-ranking and well-respected Freemason, Knigge was a man deeply embedded in the esoteric and political networks of the era. He had grown disillusioned with the state of Freemasonry, which he felt had devolved into either frivolous social gatherings or esoteric flights into Rosicrucian mysticism, lacking a clear, rational purpose. He was searching for a secret order with a concrete philosophical mission to improve society. It was this very dissatisfaction that made him the perfect candidate for the Illuminati. Introduced to the order by the Marquis de Costanzo, Knigge was presented with a vision of a secret society that aimed to perfect humanity through reason, the very thing he found lacking in other lodges. Taking the pseudonym Philo, Knigge did not simply join the Illuminati, he fundamentally re-engineered it, recognizing that Weishaupt's original 3-grade system was crude and unattractive to sophisticated Masons. Knigge undertook a complete overhaul. He designed a new, elaborate, multi-class structure, directly mirroring the progressive degrees of Freemasonry. This was a stroke of genius. It allowed the Illuminati to present itself as the secret, innermost circle of Masonry, a higher and more purposeful destination for Masons who had advanced through the standard degrees. Armed with this new, more appealing structure, Knigge leveraged his vast network of contacts. Where Weishaupt had recruited cautiously from his immediate circle, Knigge reached across the German-speaking lands, bringing in a flood of high-profile members. He initiated powerful figures from the courts of Weimar and Gotha, including Duke Ernst II of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg and Karl August, Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. Through these connections, literary giants like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Johann Gottfried Herder were brought into the order's orbit. Knigge's efforts transformed the Illuminati almost overnight from an obscure Bavarian club into a prestigious pan-German movement with members embedded in the highest echelons of government, academia, and the arts. He provided the practical, organizational, and social architecture that Weishaupt's abstract philosophical blueprint had desperately needed. Without the arrival of Philo, the Illuminati would likely have remained a footnote in the history of Ingolstadt. With him, it became a genuine force in the German Enlightenment. Baron von Knigge's masterstroke was not simply in redesigning the Illuminati's structure, but in deploying that structure as a tool for a systematic and covert takeover of German Freemasonry. He recognized that building a secret society from the ground up was a slow and perilous endeavor. A far more efficient path was to seize control of an existing, respected, and widespread network. Freemasonry, with its established lodges, internal hierarchies, and membership of influential men across the German states, was the perfect host organism. Knigge's strategy was one of parasitic infiltration, predicated on a simple but brilliant deception. The Illuminati was not a new society, but the long-lost, highest, and most secret circle of Freemasonry itself. This narrative was irresistible to ambitious Masons who felt their own lodges offered little more than social ritual or impenetrable Rosicrucian allegory. The Illuminati promised them the true, rational secret that Masonry had supposedly forgotten. The process of infiltration was methodical. An illuminatus already active within a Masonic lodge, known as an insinuator, would carefully observe his Masonic brethren. He would identify those who displayed a rationalist, anti-clerical bent and a frustration with the lodge's direction. These select individuals would be cautiously approached, not with an invitation to a new order, but with hints of a more profound level of Masonic knowledge available to a chosen few. The candidate was thus recruited without ever realizing he was leaving Freemasonry. He believed he was ascending within it. Nigge directed this effort with strategic precision, targeting the most prestigious lodges in key cities like Munich, Frankfurt, and Weimar. His primary objective was to recruit the master of the chair, the leader of a lodge. Once the master was an Illuminatus, he could subtly influence the lodge's entire membership, guiding its discussions toward enlightened principles and identifying further recruits. This strategy could effectively flip an entire lodge, turning it into a front and recruiting pool for the Illuminati, with most of its members being none the wiser. The pinnacle of this strategy came in 1782 at the Great Masonic Congress of Wilhelmsbad. While Weishaupt remained in the shadows, Nigge attended as a prominent Masonic reformer. There, he skillfully networked, promoting his revised Illuminati system as the solution to the fractures and confusion plaguing German Freemasonry. He successfully recruited some of the most influential figures in the Masonic world, including Johann Bode, a key Masonic publisher, and Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick, the nominal head of German Freemasonry. While he did not achieve a formal takeover, the Congress served as a massive recruiting event that lent the Illuminati an unprecedented veneer of legitimacy. Through this systematic infiltration, Nigge transformed Weishaupt's order into a shadow empire, its roots now deeply entangled with the very heart of the German esoteric establishment. The summer of 1782 marked the zenith of the Illuminati's influence within the esoteric world, an achievement realized not in a clandestine forest meeting, but in the open halls of a major international convention. The Masonic Congress of Wilhelmsbad, convened near the city of Hanau, was ostensibly called to resolve the existential crisis gripping German Freemasonry. The dominant rite of strict observance was faltering, its elaborate claims of direct succession from the Knights Templar proving unsubstantiated, and its finances in disarray. Delegates from across Europe, from France and Italy to the German states, gathered to chart a new course. Into this environment of uncertainty and disillusionment stepped Baron von Knigge, not merely as a Masonic delegate, but as the chief strategist for an order poised to seize the ideological reins of the entire movement. While Adam Weishaupt remained secluded in Bavaria, Knigge operated with masterful diplomacy on the Congress floor. He did not attempt a direct assault or an open declaration of the Illuminati's existence. Instead, he presented its core tenets as the logical and necessary future for a reformed, rational Freemasonry. To delegates weary of mystical quests for lost Templar masters and alchemical secrets, Knigge offered a system grounded in reason, meritocracy, and a tangible plan for social improvement. His newly structured grades were presented as a perfected Masonic path, one that led to genuine enlightenment rather than historical fantasy. His arguments found a highly receptive audience among the rationalist factions present. The most significant outcome of the Congress was the formal dissolution of the strict observance's Templar mythos, a decision that created an immense ideological vacuum. Nigge and his allies, including the influential writer and publisher Johann Bode, skillfully moved to fill that void. Throughout the weeks of the Congress, Nigge engaged in relentless private networking, holding secret meetings in which he revealed the Illuminati's higher purpose to carefully selected, high-ranking Masons. His greatest prize was his influence over Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick, the Grand Master of the Strict Observance. While Ferdinand never officially became an Illuminatus, he was deeply impressed by the order's system and subsequently lent it his tacit approval, a signal that carried enormous weight. By the time the Congress concluded, the Illuminati had achieved a de facto victory. It had recruited key Masonic leaders, disseminated its ideology at the highest levels, and positioned itself as the heir apparent to the most powerful branch of German Freemasonry, all without revealing its true name to the uninitiated. Baron von Knigge's primary tool for the Masonic takeover was the sophisticated and appealing degree system he personally engineered. He understood that Weishaupt's original three-step structure was far too simplistic to entice high-ranking Masons accustomed to elaborate, multi-layered ritual hierarchies. To remedy this, Nigger devised a complex curriculum divided into 3 distinct classes, each containing its own progressive grades. This new structure served as both a recruitment funnel and an ideological filter, gradually stripping away a candidate's conventional beliefs as he ascended toward the order's true radical core. The first class, the nursery, retained the essence of Weishaupt's original design, containing the grades of novice minival and illuminated minival. This was the preparatory school, where new non-Masonic recruits were educated in rationalist thought, subjected to the order's internal surveillance, and trained in the art of secret observation. The second and most crucial class contained the Masonic grades, Nigger's Great Innovation. This class was subdivided into 2 sections. The first, the symbolic grades, consisted of apprentice, fellow, and master, the 3 standard degrees of Blue Lodge Freemasonry. This allowed the Illuminati to absorb existing Masons directly into the order at a rank equivalent to their current standing, flattering their egos and making the transition seamless. Above these were the Scottish grades of Scottish Novice and Scottish Knight. These were based on the higher degrees of Masonic chivalry, designed to appeal to Masons from the strict observance rite. At these levels, the initiate was told that the Illuminati possessed the true secrets that Freemasonry had lost, and that the order's goal was to restore a world free from the tyranny of superstition and despotism. Only those who proved their unwavering loyalty and intellectual rigor in the lower classes were admitted to the third and final class, the mysteries. This was the sanctum sanctorum of the Illuminati, where the veil was fully lifted. The lesser mysteries contained the grades of priest and regent. Here, the initiate learned that the religious symbolism of the lower degrees was a mere allegory for a rational deistic philosophy, and that the ultimate aim was to create a moral regimen to govern the world. Finally, the greater mysteries revealed the order's ultimate revolutionary vision in the grades of Magus and King. The initiate was taught that all monarchies and established religions were illegitimate obstacles to human perfectibility and must be gradually abolished, to be replaced by a world governed by the most enlightened minds, the leaders of the order itself. This intricate, graduated system was a masterpiece of indoctrination, guiding a member from popular morality to radical revolution, 1 secret degree at a time. Passage into the lesser mysteries marked the initiate's final departure from the allegorical world of Freemasonry and his entry into the true philosophical heart of the Illuminati. The grades of priest and regent were where the order's revolutionary program was laid bare. Moving from veiled suggestion to explicit doctrine, upon entering the grade of priest, the member was systematically taught to deconstruct all revealed religion. He learned that the sacred texts and rituals of Christianity, which the lower degrees had treated with nominal respect, were in fact clever fictions designed by ancient rulers to control the credulous masses. The true object of worship was not a personal God, but reason itself, and the only true morality was that which could be derived from nature. In these secret lectures, Jesus of Nazareth was reinterpreted not as a divine savior, but as a great and misunderstood social reformer, an early illuminist who had attempted to teach humanity a rational path to virtue and liberty, only to have his message corrupted into a superstitious cult by his followers. This teaching was a direct and profound attack on the foundations of the Bavarian state, which rested on the divine right of kings and the authority of the Catholic Church. Having been disabused of his religious convictions, the initiate was prepared for the grade of regent. If the priest degree dismantled the church, the regent degree was designed to dismantle the state. Here, the final political objective of the Illuminati was revealed: the gradual abolition of all monarchical government, all national allegiances, and all private property. The regent was taught that patriotism was a form of tribalism that pitted man against man, and that the ultimate goal of the enlightened individual was to become a citizen of the world. He learned that the art of governance was a science to be perfected, and that the current crop of hereditary princes and corrupt ministers were wholly unfit to rule. The order's grand purpose, he was told, was to secretly train a cadre of the most virtuous and intelligent men, the regents themselves, who would one day steer humanity toward a global, stateless commonwealth. To this end, the regent was instructed in the practical arts of manipulation and control. He learned how to subtly influence men in power, how to gain control of educational institutions, and how to shape public discourse to favor the order's aims. This was the final stage of his education, transforming him from a passive student of enlightenment into an active agent of a silent, worldwide revolution. At the absolute apex of the Illuminati's intricate pyramid stood its supreme governing body, the Areopagites. Named after the ancient High Court of Athens, this council was the order's hidden executive, a secret committee whose very existence was unknown to the vast majority of members toiling in the lower grades. This was the final destination for an Illuminatus, a circle composed of the most dedicated and influential regents, hand-selected by Adam Weishaupt himself. The council was deliberately kept small, rarely exceeding a dozen members, to ensure absolute secrecy and ideological cohesion. Its roster included the most powerful figures in the movement. Weishaupt as Spartacus, the indispensable Baron von Knigge as Philo, the lawyer Franz von Zwack as Cato, and the diplomat Johann Bode as Emilius. It was within this small circle that the grand strategy for a worldwide moral revolution was debated, refined, and decreed. The Areopagites functioned as the legislative and judicial authority for the entire order. They held the power to approve or reject candidates for the highest degrees, to pass judgment on internal disputes, and to manage the order's central archives and treasury. All provincial reports detailing the character, wealth, and influence of members across Germany were funneled to them for strategic analysis. Yet, this council was not a monolith. Its sessions were characterized by intense ideological debate, primarily revolving around the fundamental conflict between its two most powerful members, Weishaupt and Knigge. Knigge, the pragmatic organizer, advocated for a more moderate path, seeking to reform society by gradually placing enlightened men in positions of influence. He saw the alliance with Freemasonry as a long-term partnership, a way to slowly steer an existing institution toward rationalist ends. Weishaupt, by contrast, harbored a far more radical and impatient vision. He viewed Freemasonry as a mere recruitment vehicle to be discarded once its usefulness had expired. His ultimate goal was not reform, but the complete and total abolition of the existing order. In the end, despite the pretense of a council, absolute power was vested in Weishaupt alone. As general of the order, he retained the authority to veto any decision made by the Areopagites, and was the sole author of the final, highest mysteries, the grades of Magus and King, which he kept secret even from some council members. This autocratic control was a constant source of friction, particularly for Knigge, who felt his monumental contributions entitled him to an equal share of authority. The power struggles within this inner sanctum, hidden from the rest of the order, would ultimately prove to be as destructive as any external threat. The success of Baron von Knigge's recruitment strategy is best measured by the astonishing caliber of the men it attracted into the Illuminati's orbit. The order's membership rolls soon read like a directory of the German Enlightenment's leading figures, encompassing reigning princes, celebrated poets, and pioneering thinkers. This influx of talent and influence was the order's greatest asset, providing it with legitimacy, financial security, and a direct line to the centers of power. Among the most significant recruits from the aristocracy was Duke Ernest II of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, who joined under the pseudonym Quintus Severus. A model of the enlightened despot, Duke Ernest was a fervent supporter of science and educational reform. His membership provided the Illuminati not just with a powerful patron, but with a territorial safe haven. His Duchy of Gotha became a major center for the order's activities, a place where its members could operate with a degree of freedom unheard of in conservative Bavaria. Another major coup was the initiation of Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a leading figure in European Freemasonry and brother-in-law to King George III of England. His adherents gave the Illuminati immense credibility within the fractured world of Masonic rites. Even more significant was the order's penetration of the intellectual elite. Johann Gottfried Herder, a towering figure of the Sturm und Drang literary movement and a foundational philosopher of history, was initiated as Demesis Pontifex. His involvement demonstrates the profound appeal of Weishaupt's vision to thinkers who were already engaged in a radical re-evaluation of human society and its institutions. The order also attracted pioneering educational reformers like Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, whose theories on pedagogy aligned perfectly with the Illuminati's core belief in the perfectibility of man through rational education. However, the most celebrated name associated with the order is that of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The literary titan was initiated into the Munich lodge Amalia in 1783, taking the name Abaris. While the full extent of his active participation remains a subject of scholarly debate, the documented fact of his membership is undeniable. The presence of a figure of Goethe's stature, even if only on the periphery, signaled the order's incredible reach and its success in positioning itself at the very heart of European cultural life. These men were not merely passive members. They were the intended instruments of the order's grand design, strategically placed to influence the courts, universities, and publishing houses that shaped the future of the German-speaking world. By the year 1784, the Bavarian Illuminati had reached the zenith of its power, transforming from a clandestine academic club into a formidable, though still hidden, force within the German-speaking world. The order's growth had been exponential. From the original 5 members in 1776, its numbers had swelled to an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 men, a secret intellectual army dispersed across more than 70 cities in the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. This was the moment Weishaupt's and Nigger's strategic vision came to its fullest fruition. The order had successfully established a pervasive network that penetrated the most vital institutions of the state, the church, and the academy. Its members were no longer just idealistic students, but were now judges, ministers, privy councillors, and university rectors. In Bavaria, the order's heartland, Illuminati members occupied crucial positions within the government bureaucracy. Men like Franz von Zwack sat on the National Council, influencing policy from within, while others held sway in the judiciary and the censorship board, subtly working to blunt the power of their Jesuit adversaries and promote enlightened legislation. The order had effectively created a shadow government, a network of like-minded officials who could coordinate their actions to promote rationalist reforms and block the appointments of religious conservatives. The University of Ingolstadt, once a Jesuit stronghold, was now thoroughly under Illuminati influence, with Weishaupt's allies holding key professorships. This academic dominance extended to other prestigious institutions, including the universities of Göttingen and Jena, where the order shaped curricula and molded the next generation of Central Europe's elite. Beyond Bavaria, the Illuminati's influence was even more striking. In the Protestant duchies of Gotha and Weimar, the order operated with near impunity under the protection of its princely members. These states became laboratories for enlightened policy and safe havens for the order's publishing activities. The network extended into the Habsburg lands, with a strong presence in Vienna and Prague, and had established outposts in Switzerland, Poland, and even France. Through its infiltration of Masonic lodges, the order had created a supranational web of connections, allowing ideas and directives to flow discreetly across borders. This period represented the apex of their practical influence, a brief but potent moment when it seemed possible that a secret society of philosophers could, through systematic and covert action, truly reshape the political and intellectual landscape of an entire continent. At the very moment the Illuminati reached its maximum influence, the seeds of its destruction were germinating within its own leadership. The partnership between Adam Weishaupt and Baron von Knigge, the visionary and the architect, had always been a marriage of convenience, built upon a shared goal but divergent methods and temperaments. This internal friction, long suppressed for the good of the cause, erupted into an irreconcilable conflict that would fatally weaken the order from within. The core of their dispute was a fundamental disagreement over the order's purpose and pace. Knigge, a man of the world and a high-ranking Freemason, envisioned a gradual, centuries-long project of enlightenment, using the existing Masonic framework to slowly place rational men in positions of power to reform society. For him, the Illuminati was a perfecting instrument for Freemasonry, an inner circle to guide the larger fraternity toward a more rational and less mystical path. Weishaupt, however, viewed this as timid and slow. His objective was not reform, but root and branch revolution. He held a deep contempt for the mystical trappings of the higher Masonic degrees, and saw the entire institution as a mere vessel for recruitment, a temporary scaffold to be kicked away once the Illuminati had built its own independent structure. This ideological chasm was exacerbated by a bitter power struggle. Weishaupt, as the order's founder and self-appointed general, demanded absolute and unquestioning obedience. He was secretive by nature, often withholding crucial information even from the Areopagites, and insisted on retaining sole authorship and control over the order's highest and most secret grades. Knigge, who had single-handedly organized the order's structure, written its most effective rituals, and recruited its most influential members, found this autocratic style intolerable. He argued for a more collegial leadership, believing his contributions had earned him the right to be Weishaupt's equal, not his subordinate. Their correspondence grew increasingly acrimonious, filled with accusations of despotism on one side and insubordination on the other. By 1784, the conflict reached its breaking point. During a council meeting, Knigge demanded that Weishaupt finally reveal the highest mysteries he had long promised. Weishaupt refused, effectively confirming Knigge's suspicion that these ultimate doctrines did not yet exist. In April of that year, feeling betrayed and marginalized, Baron von Knigge formally resigned from the order. His departure was a catastrophic blow, removing the Illuminati's most brilliant organizer and diplomat, just as the storm of external suppression was about to break. Baron von Knigge's departure from the Illuminati in April 1784 was not a quiet retreat, but the first tremor of the earthquake that would soon bring the entire edifice down. His resignation stemmed from a profound sense of disillusionment. He had joined the order believing it to be a society of equals dedicated to enlightenment, only to find himself the subordinate architect of what he came to see as a new form of despotism. He concluded that Adam Weishaupt was not interested in a collegial pursuit of reason, but in the creation of a secret empire with himself as its unseen emperor. Feeling his organizational genius had been exploited only to be cast aside, Knigge left not as a silent dissenter, but as a man with a warning to share. Almost immediately after his break with Weishaupt, he began to publicly distance himself from the order and caution others about its true nature. His most potent weapon was the pen. In subsequent publications, most notably his 1788 work, Philons endliche Erklärung, Philo's Final Declaration, Knigge laid bare his grievances and exposed the inner workings of the order's leadership. He was careful to defend the noble, enlightened ideals that had initially attracted him, but he drew a sharp distinction between those goals and Weishaupt's manipulative and tyrannical methods. He detailed the founder's obsession with secrecy, his autocratic control over the highest degrees, and the pervasive system of internal espionage that turned members into informants against one another. He revealed that Weishaupt's ultimate aim was not the gentle reform of society, but its complete subversion and the concentration of all power into his own hands, a goal he pursued with a zeal that mirrored the Jesuitical methods he claimed to despise. These public warnings, coming from the man who was arguably the second most important figure in the order, were devastating. Knigger's impeccable reputation and extensive connections within Freemasonry meant his words carried immense weight. He was not an external critic, but a disillusioned insider, providing the first credible high-level testimony that confirmed the growing fears of the Bavarian authorities. His writings gave ammunition to the order's enemies and sowed discord among its remaining members, many of whom had been recruited by Knigge and trusted his judgment. In effect, the man who had built the Illuminati's pan-European network became a primary instrument of its unraveling, warning the world that the pursuit of a perfect society could, under the wrong leadership, become a perfect system of control. While Baron von Knigge's public warnings signaled the beginning of the end, the fatal blow to the Illuminati came not from a high-profile resignation, but from a series of calculated betrayals from within its own ranks. Several members, having ascended to the higher degrees, became deeply alarmed by the radical nature of the doctrines being revealed. What had been presented as a society for moral perfection was, in their view, a conspiracy to overthrow all established religious and political order. Foremost among these defectors was Joseph Utzschneider, a professor at the University of Ingolstadt who had initially been an enthusiastic member. Alongside him were other concerned academics and officials, including the priest Kossendy and the librarian Grunberger, who came to believe the order posed a genuine threat to the state. Their disillusionment was not born of personal disputes but of ideological terror. As initiates into the regent grade, they were exposed to Weishaupt's true vision, a world without princes or priests, where the Illuminati's secret council would govern humanity. They learned of the order's classification of governments as illegitimate and its ultimate goal of abolishing private property, patriotism, and traditional family structures. For men who were themselves servants of the state and church, this was not enlightenment, but a blueprint for anarchy and atheism. Motivated by a mixture of genuine fear, moral duty, and a desire to protect their own positions, they resolved to expose the conspiracy. Their chosen confidant was Maria Anna, the Duchess Dowager of Bavaria. A woman of deep religious piety and conservative conviction, she was the widow of the previous elector and held considerable influence in the Munich court. Utzschneider and his co-conspirators understood that a direct appeal to the reigning elector, Charles Theodore, might be dismissed as academic squabbling. The Duchess, however, was a known opponent of the Enlightenment's perceived excesses and the perfect champion for their cause. In a series of secret meetings in 1784, they provided her with detailed testimony, revealing the order's secret structure, its system of pseudonyms, its subversive goals, and, most critically, a list of its most influential members. This was no longer hearsay, it was a comprehensive intelligence brief delivered by credible insiders. The Duchess, in turn, presented this damning evidence to the elector, confirming his deepest suspicions and providing him with the concrete justification he needed to unleash the full power of the state against the hidden society that had taken root in the heart of his kingdom. The detailed warnings delivered by Joseph Utzschneider and his fellow defectors did not fall upon deaf ears. Rather, they landed on the fertile ground of pre-existing and deeply held suspicion. The government of Elector Karl Theodor of Bavaria was already primed to view any secret organization, particularly one espousing Enlightenment ideals, as a direct and existential threat. Karl Theodor was a ruler defined by his conservative convictions, a staunch defender of the absolute authority of the monarchy and the unquestionable supremacy of the Catholic Church. Having inherited the Bavarian electorate, he ruled with the mindset of a traditionalist autocrat, viewing the state as an organism whose health depended on a rigid hierarchy and unwavering obedience to the twin pillars of throne and altar. From this perspective, the abstract principles of the Enlightenment were not pathways to progress but doctrines of sedition. The very idea of popular sovereignty, natural rights, or the primacy of individual reason was seen as a direct assault on the divinely ordained order of society. Secret societies in general, and Freemasonry in particular, were already a source of significant anxiety for his government. They operated outside the sanctioned structures of the state, fostered loyalties that superseded allegiance to the sovereign, and created private spaces where subversive ideas could be discussed without fear of reprisal. The Illuminati, however, was perceived as something far more malignant. Rumors had long circulated within the Munich court about a radical new society that was not merely philosophical, but actively political. Court advisors, many of whom were ex-Jesuits displaced from their academic posts by men like Weishaupt, actively fueled the electors' paranoia. They portrayed the Illuminati not as a group of harmless intellectuals, but as an organized conspiracy of atheists and Republicans, bent on replicating the perceived chaos of Protestant states within the Catholic heartland of Bavaria. These advisors understood that the order's recruitment of government officials, judges, and military officers was not an intellectual exercise, but a strategic infiltration aimed at seizing the levers of power from within. Long before the detailed testimony of the defectors, Karl Theodor's government had come to see the Illuminati as the concrete manifestation of its greatest fears, a clandestine, disciplined, and ideologically motivated force committed to the complete annihilation of the existing social and political system. Fueled by the damning testimony of the order's defectors and propelled by his own deep-seated fear of subversion, Elector Karl Theodor moved to translate suspicion into state action. The government's first official countermeasure was delivered on June 22, 1784, in the form of a sweeping electoral edict. This decree was a masterstroke of legal ambiguity, a carefully worded prohibition that did not once mention the Illuminati by name. Instead, it declared a general ban on all communities, societies, and brotherhoods within the electorate that had been established without the express approval and sanction of the sovereign. This broad and deliberately vague language allowed the government to cast the widest possible net, effectively criminalizing any form of unauthorized association. The edict's primary, albeit unstated, target was unequivocally the Illuminati, but its general nature also served as a clear warning to the numerous Freemasonic lodges operating in Bavaria. By outlawing all unsanctioned groups, the government sidestepped the need to prove specific seditious acts by any single organization, instead making the very act of secret assembly an offense against the state. The legal foundation for this action rested on the principle of absolute monarchy, which held that all legitimate authority and association flowed directly from the sovereign. Any society that formed its own rules, demanded its own oaths of loyalty, and operated in secrecy was, by definition, a challenge to this principle, a state within a state, an intolerable affront to the elector's total authority. For the members of the Illuminati, the edict was a chilling development. It transformed their clandestine activities from a private philosophical pursuit into a publicly illegal enterprise. While Weishaupt initially urged calm, instructing his followers to simply cease meeting for a time, the decree's impact was immediate and corrosive. It introduced a new level of peril into all their communications and gatherings. The risk of discovery now carried not just the threat of social disgrace, but of official state punishment. This new atmosphere of fear began to thin the order's ranks, as members who were prominent public officials, cautious academics, or simply less committed to the cause began to quietly sever their ties, unwilling to jeopardize their careers and freedom. The Edict of 1784 was not the final blow, but it was the first swing of the axe, a public declaration of war that forced the Illuminati deeper into the shadows and marked the beginning of their systematic dismantlement. While the Bavarian state was methodically building its case against the Illuminati through edicts and investigations, a single, dramatic event would provide the government with what it presented as its most undeniable proof, a moment that has since become a cornerstone of Illuminati conspiracy lore. The story, which blurs the line between historical incident and propagandistic narrative, centers on a man named Jacob Lanz. Lanz, a retired priest, was acting as a courier for the order, tasked with transporting sensitive documents from the Illuminati's leadership to its operatives in Silesia. In July of 1785, As he rode on horseback near the town of Ratisbon, a sudden and violent summer thunderstorm descended upon the plains. In a moment of extraordinary misfortune, Lanz was struck by a bolt of lightning and killed instantly. When local authorities discovered the body, they also found his satchel. Inside was not the correspondence of a simple priest, but a collection of papers that would electrify the Bavarian government. The documents allegedly included detailed plans for the order's expansion, lists of its members, and, most damningly, specific instructions for instigating popular uprisings. Among the papers was said to be a tract entitled Original Writings of the Order of the Illuminati, which outlined some of the society's most radical goals. While the authenticity and precise content of these specific documents have been the subject of historical debate, their discovery by the authorities is a matter of record. For the electors' government, this was the ultimate vindication. The testimony of disgruntled ex-members could be dismissed as score-settling, but physical documents seized from a dead courier were irrefutable. It was a propaganda coup of the highest order. Here was tangible evidence that the Illuminati was not a mere philosophical society, but an active, organized conspiracy with a concrete agenda for revolution. The event was immediately framed as an act of divine intervention, a sign from heaven itself exposing the godless plot against the throne and the church. The story of the lightning strike was rapidly disseminated, transforming the state's methodical suppression into a dramatic crusade against a hidden evil. This single, fatal accident provided the Bavarian authorities with the final justification they needed to escalate their campaign from prohibition to outright persecution, launching a series of raids and arrests that would shatter the order's remaining secrecy and expose its inner workings to the world. The ambiguous general ban of 1784 and the dramatic discovery of Jacob Lanz's documents served as the prelude to the Bavarian state's final decisive action. Armed with what it considered incontrovertible physical proof of sedition, the government of Karl Theodor saw no further need for subtlety. On August 2, 1785, a second and far more explicit edict was issued, a legal instrument designed not merely to prohibit, but to annihilate. This time, all pretense of generality was abandoned. The decree specifically named the Order of the Illuminati as its target, along with the Freemasons, officially branding them as organizations hostile to religion and the state. This act transformed the legal landscape for every member of the order. The new edict was not a warning, it was a declaration of persecution. It made membership in the Illuminati, past or present, a high crime against the state. The penalties were severe and designed to dismantle the order's influence at its source. Any government official, academic or military officer found to be a member faced immediate dismissal from their post, the loss of their pension, and public disgrace. In the most severe cases, the punishment could extend to the confiscation of property and even exile from Bavaria. The law was made retroactive, meaning that even those who had previously renounced their affiliation were not safe from prosecution. This created an atmosphere of intense paranoia, where former associations could be used as a weapon in personal and professional rivalries. This second edict was accompanied by a government-sponsored propaganda campaign. The state began publishing the documents it had seized, including the order's internal rituals, membership lists, and correspondence. These publications, titled Some Original Writings of the Order of the Illuminati, were designed to shock the public and expose the society's atheistic and anti-monarchical doctrines. The effect was devastating. The Illuminati was no longer a shadowy rumor, but a publicly documented conspiracy, its secret teachings laid bare for all to see. The combination of targeted legislation and public shaming proved fatal. The order's structure, already weakened by internal division and the first ban, completely collapsed under this direct assault. Raids were conducted, prominent members were arrested and interrogated, and the once powerful network that had stretched across the German states was shattered. The Edict of August 1785 marked the official, unequivocal end of the historical order of the Illuminati within Bavaria, driving its founder into exile and scattering its remaining members to the winds. With the full legal authority of the 1785 edict behind them, Bavarian officials initiated a series of targeted raids designed to decapitate the Illuminati's remaining leadership and seize its institutional memory. The most significant of these operations took place in October 1786, targeting the homes of the order's most influential figures. Foremost among them was Franz Xaver von Zwack, a government official and one of Weishaupt's earliest and most trusted lieutenants. Known within the order by the pseudonym Cato, Zwack had served as a member of the Supreme Areopagite Council and, crucially, as the keeper of the order's archives. It was in his residence that the authorities would find their greatest prize. The search of Zwack's home, along with that of other high-ranking members, yielded a vast and meticulously organized collection of the Illuminati's most secret papers. This was no mere satchel of traveling notes, but the very heart of the organization's operations. Investigators uncovered hundreds of letters exchanged between Weishaupt, Knigge, and the provincial leaders, laying bare their strategies, their disputes, and their unvarnished opinions of their subordinates. They found the complete, unedited rituals for the higher degrees, including the grades of priest and regent, which contained the order's most radical philosophical positions. These texts confirmed the state's worst fears, explicitly detailing a plan to abolish monarchies, private property, and all established religions in favor of a universal republic guided by reason. The seized archive also contained the tangible machinery of the order's methods. There were tables of secret ciphers, instructions for creating invisible ink, and detailed manuals on the art of recruitment and manipulation. Most damning were the collections of character reports from the internal surveillance system, proving the order's practice of systematically spying on its own members and on external targets. Furthermore, the documents included treatises on atheism, defenses of suicide, and, most scandalously, plans for a female branch of the order and even a recipe for inducing abortions. For the conservative Bavarian state, this trove of documents was the ultimate proof of the Illuminati's profound moral and political depravity. The seizure of these papers marked the definitive end of the order as a functioning entity. Its innermost secrets were now in the hands of its enemies, ready to be published and used as the primary evidence in the construction of a conspiracy theory that would soon terrify all of Europe. Following the successful raids and the seizure of the order's archives, the Bavarian state turned its attention to the human element of the conspiracy, the captured members themselves. With key figures in custody, a series of formal interrogations began, designed to extract confessions that would corroborate the damning evidence found in the seized documents. These were not medieval inquisitions, but systematic legal inquiries conducted by state magistrates. The process was a combination of intense questioning, psychological pressure, and offers of clemency in exchange for full disclosure. The authorities sought to understand not only the order's ultimate goals, but its precise operational methods, its chain of command, and the full extent of its membership. The testimonies gathered from these sessions would provide the final pieces of the puzzle for the prosecution. Under questioning, high-ranking members, often facing the ruin of their careers and the loss of their property, began to talk. Professors like Anton von Massenhausen and other figures from the academic world provided detailed accounts of the order's recruitment techniques within the University of Ingolstadt. They confirmed the existence and purpose of the Minerval schools, explaining how students were encouraged to spy on their peers and superiors, with their reports being funneled up the hierarchy. Other captured officials, seeking to save themselves, offered detailed organograms of the order's leadership, identifying the Areopagites and the provincial superiors by their real names, thus stripping away the anonymity that their classical pseudonyms had once provided. Crucially, the interrogations confirmed the strategy of Masonic infiltration. Captured members explained, step by step, how Knigge's plan was implemented, how they would join a Masonic lodge, identify its most influential members, and gradually recruit them into the Illuminati's higher, secret degrees. These confessions transformed the state's suspicion into a certainty, proving a deliberate and systematic plot to co-opt a respected fraternal organization for subversive ends. The testimonies of disillusioned lower-ranking members were particularly valuable, as they spoke of the deception involved in their own recruitment, confirming that the order's true, radical aims were concealed from initiates until they were too deeply enmeshed to withdraw. These official depositions, once recorded and certified, were published by the state, serving as the final, unassailable proof that justified the complete eradication of the order. While the Bavarian state dismantled his organization and interrogated his followers, Adam Weishaupt, the man at the center of the storm, became a fugitive. The publication of the order's secret papers, which explicitly named him as the founder and detailed his most radical thoughts, transformed him from a respected professor into the public face of sedition. In early 1785, even before the final edict was issued, the pressure had become unbearable. The University of Ingolstadt, once his power base, could no longer protect him. Stripped of his prestigious chair in canon law and facing imminent arrest, Weishaupt's life in Bavaria was over. His only option was to flee. His escape was a hasty and clandestine affair, a stark contrast to the meticulous planning that had characterized his secret society. Leaving behind his home, his career, and the network he had spent nearly a decade building, Weishaupt crossed the border out of the electorate's jurisdiction, seeking sanctuary from the persecution that was sure to follow. He found it in the free imperial city of Regensburg, but this was only a temporary haven. He needed a powerful protector, a ruler who was not intimidated by the Bavarian government and who was sympathetic to the Enlightenment ideals that had inspired his now outlawed order. He found such a patron in Duke Ernest II of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg. The Duchy of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg was a well-known bastion of the German Enlightenment. Duke Ernest II was himself a man of reason, a known Freemason who had fostered an atmosphere of intellectual tolerance and inquiry within his court. He had corresponded with many of the leading thinkers of the age and was personally acquainted with several high-ranking Illuminati members, including Baron von Knigge. When Weishaupt appealed to him for protection, the Duke saw not a dangerous revolutionary, but a persecuted intellectual. In 1786, he formally granted Weishaupt asylum in Gotha, providing him with a pension and the title of Hofrat, or court councillor. This act of patronage was a direct rebuke to the conservative reactions sweeping through Bavaria. From the safety of Gotha, Weishaupt would spend the rest of his life in exile, cut off from his remaining followers but free to write. He would produce a series of books and pamphlets defending the Illuminati's original aims and fiercely attacking his persecutors, attempting to salvage his legacy from the conspiracy theories that were already beginning to form around his name. Safely ensconced within the intellectual sanctuary of Gotha, Adam Weishaupt embarked on the final and perhaps most futile phase of his life's work, the battle for his own legacy. Granted a pension and a title by Duke Ernest II, he was shielded from Bavarian retribution, but was effectively isolated, a general without an army. His response to this forced retirement was to take up the pen, launching a prolific literary counteroffensive against his accusers. Between 1786 and 1787, he produced a torrent of apologetic works, most notably A Complete History of the Persecutions of the Illuminati in Bavaria, and An Apology for the Illuminati. These texts were not confessions but impassioned, systematic defenses of his original vision. In these writings, Weishaupt meticulously argued that the Illuminati, in its pure form, was nothing more than an educational project. He presented the order as a modern school of wisdom, dedicated to the moral and intellectual perfection of its members through reason and secular ethics. He insisted that its ultimate goal was not the violent overthrow of states, but the gradual creation of a more enlightened humanity that would, in some distant future, no longer require the coercive structures of monarchy or the church. Weishaupt portrayed the most incriminating elements found in the seized papers, the anti-monarchical diatribes, the atheistic leanings as theoretical explorations, intellectual exercises for the highest grades, not as a concrete revolutionary agenda. He painted a picture of a benevolent philosophical society destroyed by the paranoia of a tyrannical state and the jealousy of its enemies, particularly the Rosicrucians and ex-Jesuits. He attempted to frame the internal espionage system not as a tool of control, but as a pedagogical method for character assessment, a way for superiors to guide the moral development of their charges. However, these defences rang hollow against the weight of his own captured correspondence, which the Bavarian government had already published for all to read. His attempts to present the order as a peaceful philosophical club were directly contradicted by the detailed hierarchical structure, the strict oaths of obedience, and the explicit strategies for infiltration that his own papers described. Weishaupt's apologetic works failed to sway public opinion. Instead, they became essential source material for the very conspiracy theorists he sought to debunk. His final decades were spent in quiet academic pursuit, a life of scholarship that stood in stark contrast to the grand, subversive ambitions of his youth, dying in 1830, long after the world had decided what to believe about the order he had created. The Bavarian edicts of 1785 successfully shattered the Illuminati's organizational structure, but they did not eliminate its members. While the state's actions were decisive, they were not a bloodbath. The primary punishments were dismissal from government posts, loss of academic positions, and exile. This official dismantling, however, inadvertently created the conditions for a new and far more enduring phase of the order's existence, its life as a persistent rumor. The suppression triggered a diaspora of its most dedicated and influential figures who scattered from Bavaria across the patchwork of German states and into the wider European intellectual landscape. This dispersal of individuals, each carrying the order's secrets and ideals, was the critical mechanism that transformed a defunct Bavarian society into a phantom international conspiracy. Key figures sought refuge and new careers wherever they could find them, often leveraging the very networks they had cultivated within the order. Franz Xaver von Zwack, the Areopagity whose home had been raided, eventually found a new respectable position in the administration of the electorate of the Palatinate in Heidelberg. Johann Martin, Count of Stolberg-Rosler, another prominent member, simply returned to his estates outside of Bavarian jurisdiction. These men did not go into hiding. They were educated aristocrats and administrators who resumed their lives and careers in new locations. To an outside observer, however, the reappearance of a known Illuminatus in a position of influence in a different court looked less like a man finding new employment and more like an agent being redeployed. This pattern was repeated across the Holy Roman Empire. The ex-Illuminati were a highly mobile and well-connected group. They continued to correspond with one another, joined new Masonic lodges, and participated in the scholarly debates of the day. Their presence in cities like Weimar, Hamburg, and even Paris was noted by conservative critics and nervous authorities. Every time a former member published a paper, secured a university post, or gained a political appointment, it was interpreted by a growing chorus of anti-Illuminati writers not as an individual success, but as evidence of the secret society's continued clandestine operation. The physical scattering of its members was the single most important factor in the myth of its survival. The order was no longer a centralized body in Ingolstadt, but a decentralized idea, carried in the minds of exiles whose very presence in new cities was enough to convince observers that the conspiracy was not dead, but had simply metastasized. Having successfully suppressed the Illuminati and scattered its leadership, the government of Karl Theodor faced a problem of public perception. To justify its severe actions against a society that counted respected nobles and academics among its members, the electorate needed to prove that the threat was real and substantial. Simple edicts were not enough. The state required a definitive exposé. In a decision that would prove to be one of history's great ironies, the government chose transparency as its weapon. Beginning in 1787, it sanctioned the official publication of the documents seized from the homes of Zwack and other members. These volumes, titled Einige Originalschriften des Illuminatenordens, some original writings of the Order of the Illuminati, and a later supplement, were intended to be the final nail in the order's coffin. Instead, they became the seeds of its immortality. For the first time, the general public had direct access to the inner workings of the secret society. The published papers laid bare the entire system, the hierarchical degrees, the classical pseudonyms, the intricate ciphers, the rituals, and, most damningly, the private correspondence of its leaders. Weishaupt's most radical and unguarded thoughts were printed for all to see: his contempt for organized religion, his plans to abolish monarchies, his strategies for infiltrating state institutions, and his cynical views on manipulating new recruits. The government's intent was clear: to shock the public and demonstrate the seditious, atheistic nature of the conspiracy it had crushed. In this, it was initially successful, creating a wave of conservative horror across the German states. But the long-term effect was the exact opposite of what was intended. By publishing the secret writings, the Bavarian government took a regional, defunct organization and broadcast its ideology across Europe. The books became instant bestsellers, translated and reprinted in cities far beyond Bavaria's reach. What was meant to be an autopsy became a manual. For the first time, the name Illuminati was associated not with vague rumors, but with a concrete, documented plan for world revolution. These official government publications became the foundational texts for every subsequent conspiracy theory. They were the proof, the primary source material that anti-revolutionary writers would cite for decades to come, ensuring that the ideas Weishaupt had confined to secret correspondence would achieve a level of fame and influence he could never have secured on his own. The historical Bavarian Illuminati, for all the grandiosity of its ambitions and the enduring power of its myth, was in reality a remarkably short-lived and fragile enterprise. Its effective existence spanned less than a decade, a brief, incandescent flash in the intellectual landscape of the late 18th century. Its ultimate failure was not the result of a single decisive blow, but a collapse brought on by a combination of profound internal flaws and overwhelming external pressure. The dream of a perfected, rational humanity, guided by a secret cadre of the enlightened, was ultimately dissolved by the very human frailties it sought to transcend. Foremost among its fatal weaknesses was the deeply paradoxical nature of its founder, Adam Weishaupt. He envisioned a world free from tyranny, yet he governed his own order with an autocratic and paranoid control that alienated his most capable lieutenants. The system of mutual surveillance, designed as a tool for moral education, fostered an atmosphere of distrust and suspicion that poisoned the very fraternity he claimed to be building. The power struggle with Baron von Knigge was not merely a clash of personalities, but a fundamental schism over the order's direction and soul, a conflict between Weishaupt's rigid, theoretical utopianism and Knigge's pragmatic approach to recruitment and organization. Knigge's departure robbed the order of its most effective architect at the precise moment it needed him most. Furthermore, the Illuminati's rapid expansion became a victim of its own success. The strategy of infiltrating Masonic lodges, while effective for recruitment, also compromised the order's secrecy. It grew too quickly, absorbing members whose commitment to its radical core tenets was shallow and whose discretion was unreliable. This uncontrolled growth made the society porous and vulnerable, transforming it from a disciplined, secretive cabal into a sprawling, unwieldy network that was impossible to effectively manage or keep hidden. The very state it sought to undermine, the conservative electorate of Bavaria, proved to be a far more determined and efficient enemy than Weishaupt had anticipated. Operating on its home ground, the Bavarian government had the political will and the police power to methodically investigate, expose, and dismantle the organization. The Illuminati's theoretical plans for subversion were no match for the practical realities of state power, especially after its internal secrets were laid bare by its own published documents. The Bavarian government's publication of the Illuminati's secret papers was a profound miscalculation. Intended to expose and ridicule a defeated foe, the act instead provided a detailed blueprint of subversion that terrified the conservative principalities of the Holy Roman Empire. The period between the order's dissolution in 1785 and the storming of the Bastille in 1789 was not one of relief, but of escalating paranoia. This pre-revolutionary hysteria, concentrated in the German-speaking lands, was the fertile soil in which the Illuminati myth first took root and began to grow into something far larger and more menacing than the historical order had ever been. A new genre of counter-revolutionary literature emerged, penned by conservative academics, disgruntled Freemasons, and government officials who saw the Illuminati not as a defunct club of Bavarian intellectuals, but as the visible arm of a vast ongoing conspiracy against all religion and government. Figures like the Viennese professor Leopold Alois Hoffmann and the theologian Johann August von Stark became central voices in this burgeoning panic. They pored over the published Illuminati documents and began to construct a narrative of a conspiracy that had not been destroyed, but had merely gone deeper underground. In their writings, the Illuminati were transformed into the secret puppet masters behind the entire Enlightenment project. Every rationalist argument, every critique of clerical authority, every call for republican governance was reinterpreted as a component of the Illuminati's master plan. A key text from this period was Ernst August von Gochhausen's 1786 book, Revelations about the Cosmopolitan System of Politics, which explicitly warned that a secret society was working to bring down all European thrones. This atmosphere of suspicion turned any progressive or secretive organization into a potential Illuminati front. The most prominent victim of this hysteria was the German Union, a reading society founded by the controversial theologian Carl Friedrich Barth. The Union's stated goal was to disseminate Enlightenment literature to a wider audience, a project entirely in keeping with the intellectual currents of the age. However, because it was organized into a secret hierarchical structure, conservative critics immediately branded it as the resurrected Illuminati. Pamphlets and books were published denouncing the German Union as a vehicle for spreading atheism and sedition, forcing its collapse under the weight of public accusation. This episode demonstrated a crucial shift. The fear was no longer about what the Illuminati had done, but about what it was still doing through other guises. This pre-existing framework of conspiracy was fully formed and widely accepted in conservative German circles years before the events in France, providing a ready-made explanation for the revolution when it finally erupted. The pre-revolutionary hysteria that had simmered in the German states was merely a local tremor before the earthquake. When the Bastille fell in 1789, the shockwaves radiated across Europe, shattering the perceived permanence of the old order. To the monarchies, aristocracies, and clergies of the continent, the events unfolding in France were not just a political crisis, they were an existential cataclysm. The French Revolution was an event of such unprecedented scale and velocity that it defied conventional explanation. For conservative observers, the idea that centuries of tradition, monarchy, and religious authority could be dismantled by a spontaneous uprising of the common people was both incomprehensible and terrifying. Simple explanations rooted in economic hardship or political incompetence seemed entirely inadequate to account for the systematic, philosophical nature of the assault on the Ancien Régime. This was not merely a rebellion, it was an inversion of the natural order of the world. The execution of King Louis XVI in 1793 was the point of no return, an act that symbolized the complete rejection of the divine right of kings. The subsequent Reign of Terror, with its revolutionary tribunals and the ceaseless work of the guillotine, appeared not as an excess of popular anger, but as a methodical, cold-blooded purge. The radical de-Christianization campaign, culminating in the establishment of the cult of reason and the enthronement of a goddess of reason in Notre Dame Cathedral, confirmed the deepest fears of the devout. This was not just a political revolution, it was a declared war on God himself. Faced with this terrifying chaos, a powerful intellectual need arose to find a hidden hand, a secret cause that could make sense of the madness. The concept of a leaderless, popular revolution was more frightening than that of a conspiracy, because a conspiracy implied a plan, an enemy that could be identified, understood, and fought. A spontaneous event of this magnitude suggested that civilization itself was inherently unstable. This desperate search for a cause did not have to look far. The German panic of the preceding years had already provided a perfect culprit. The Bavarian government's published writings of the Illuminati contained a detailed, step-by-step plan for the abolition of monarchy, private property, and all religion. The events in France did not just resemble this plan. To many horrified onlookers, they appeared to be its direct and terrifying execution. While many conservative voices searched for a hidden cause behind the French Revolution, it was a French Jesuit priest, Augustin Barruel, who would synthesize these fears into a single, comprehensive, and terrifyingly influential narrative. Writing from exile in London, Barruel had witnessed the destruction of his world, the execution of his king, the suppression of his church, and the violent upheaval of his society. Between 1797 and 1798, he published his magnum opus, the multi-volume Memoirs pour servir à l'histoire du jacobinisme, or Memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism. This work was not a mere pamphlet, but a sprawling, meticulously argued historical investigation that purported to prove, with documentary evidence, that the revolution was the premeditated result of a century-long conspiracy. Barruel's central thesis presented a three-tiered plot, a conspiracy within a conspiracy. The first layer was what he termed the conspiracy of the sophists of impiety, led by Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, Diderot, and D'Alembert. He argued that these thinkers had orchestrated a systematic campaign to destroy Christianity, which they saw as the essential foundation for social order and monarchical authority. Their writings and intellectual salons were not instruments of free inquiry, but weapons in a calculated war against the altar. The second layer was the conspiracy of the sophists of rebellion, which he located within the lodges of Freemasonry. Barruel contended that the lower degrees of Masonry were a benign fraternal cover for a secret inner circle that pursued the political goal of overthrowing all thrones, promoting the ideals of liberty and equality as a means to dismantle all established government. The third and most crucial layer of the plot was the conspiracy of the sophists of impiety and anarchy, embodied by the Bavarian Illuminati. For Barruel, the Illuminati was the final synthesis, the point where the anti-Christian plot of the philosophers merged with the anti-monarchical plot of the Masons. He argued that Adam Weishaupt's order had successfully infiltrated and taken control of continental Freemasonry, using its established network as the delivery mechanism for its own far more radical agenda. The Jacobin clubs that drove the French Revolution were, in his view, the direct descendants and public face of the Illuminati's secret lodges. The revolution's most radical phases, from the execution of the king to the de-Christianization campaign, were presented as the direct execution of Weishaupt's original, published plans. Barruel's work became an immediate international bestseller, providing a seemingly coherent and evidence-based explanation for the chaos that had engulfed Europe and permanently cementing the Bavarian Illuminati as the secret architects of modern revolution. Almost simultaneously with Augustin Barruel's work, and entirely independent of it, a second, powerful voice emerged from across the English Channel to confirm the world's darkest fears. This voice belonged not to a Catholic cleric fleeing the revolution, but to one of Britain's most respected men of science, John Robison. A professor of natural philosophy at the University of Edinburgh and the General Secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Robison was a pillar of the Scottish Enlightenment. His scientific credentials lent an air of empirical, objective authority to a theory that could have otherwise been dismissed as religious polemic. His book, Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe, carried on in the secret meetings of Freemasons, Illuminati, and Reading societies, published in 1797, would prove to be just as influential as Barruel's, particularly in the English-speaking world. Robison was himself a high-ranking Freemason, and his investigation began not as an attack on the fraternity, but as a defense of what he considered its true benevolent principles. During his travels across continental Europe, He had been invited to join several German lodges and was alarmed by the radical, anti-religious, and republican ideas he encountered. He began to believe that a hostile entity had infiltrated and corrupted the Masonic system from within. Using the same published Bavarian government documents that Barrel had studied, Roberson traced this corruption directly back to Adam Weishaupt's order. He argued that the Illuminati had developed a methodical system for hijacking Masonic lodges, using their secrecy and hierarchical structure to identify and recruit men who could be molded into agents of revolution. While Barrel's analysis focused on a Catholic worldview and saw the plot as a continuation of anti-clerical philosophical movements, Roberson's perspective was that of a British Protestant and a man of science. He was less concerned with the war against the altar and more with the threat to established government, social order, and what he termed natural religion, a rational deistic belief in a divine creator. He saw the Illuminati's ultimate goal as the complete abolition of property, the subversion of national loyalties, and the establishment of a single tyrannical world government ruled by a secret elite. The fact that two respected intellectuals, a French Jesuit and a Scottish physicist, from different countries and religious traditions, had independently reached the exact same conclusion was presented as irrefutable proof. Their near-simultaneous publication created a powerful echo chamber, transforming a fringe theory into a credible international explanation for the revolutionary chaos sweeping the Western world. The immense influence of the works by Augustin Barrel and John Roberson did not derive from the strength of their evidence, but from the masterful construction of a compelling, internally consistent, yet fundamentally flawed argument. The anatomy of their proof rested on a series of powerful logical fallacies that transformed circumstantial evidence and philosophical similarities into an ironclad case for a world-altering conspiracy. The primary logical error at the heart of their thesis was the classic fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc, after this, therefore because of this. The argument was deceptively simple. The Bavarian Illuminati wrote down a plan to abolish monarchy and religion. A few years later, the French Revolution abolished monarchy and attacked religion. Therefore, the Illuminati must have caused the revolution. This line of reasoning mistakes sequence for causation, ignoring the vast and complex socio-economic forces that had been pushing France toward upheaval for decades. This foundational error was supported by a highly selective use of evidence. Barrel and Roberson treated the seized Illuminati papers not as a philosophical curriculum, but as a tactical blueprint for immediate violent action. They cherry-picked Weishaupt's most radical statements, speculations about a distant, utopian future free from government, and presented them as the order's explicit, short-term goals. The context of the Illuminati's educational program, which saw this final state as an achievement for a far-off perfected humanity, was deliberately ignored. In their hands, a philosophical end goal was twisted into a present-day revolutionary plot. Furthermore, they constructed a chain of guilt by association where no direct links existed. The method involved identifying a handful of individuals who were members of both the Illuminati and French Masonic lodges, such as the diplomat Johann Joachim Christoph Bode. From this tiny overlap, they extrapolated that the entire French Masonic apparatus, and by extension the Jacobin clubs that emerged from it, were under the secret dominion of Weishaupt's order. This ignored the fact that the vast majority of Jacobins and French Masons had never heard of the Bavarian Illuminati. Finally, the conspiracy theory was rendered unfalsifiable. The very secrecy of the alleged plot was used as its ultimate proof. Any lack of direct evidence for the Illuminati's control over the revolution was not seen as a weakness in the theory, but rather as a testament to the conspirators' diabolical cunning and success in covering their tracks. For Barrel and Roberson, the absence of evidence became the most damning evidence of all. This created a closed, circular argument that could not be empirically disproven, transforming a historical inquiry into an article of faith. The transatlantic passage of the Illuminati conspiracy theory was swift and potent. finding a remarkably receptive audience in the turbulent political landscape of the young United States. By 1798, American editions of both John Roberson's Proofs of a Conspiracy and Augustin Barruel's Memoirs were being printed and widely circulated, arriving not as obscure historical treatises, but as urgent warnings that resonated with the profound anxieties of the post-revolutionary era. The nation was locked in a bitter ideological struggle between the governing Federalist Party, which advocated for a strong central government and viewed the French Revolution with horror, and the opposition Democratic Republican Party, which championed states' rights and was broadly sympathetic to the French cause. This partisan divide created the fertile soil in which the theory would grow. The primary agent for the theory's transmission was Reverend Jedediah Morse, a prominent Congregationalist minister from Charlestown, Massachusetts, and a staunch Federalist. On May 9, 1798, Morse delivered a thunderous sermon in which he announced the discovery of a vast conspiracy, reading directly from Roberson's work. He warned his congregation that the Illuminati, having successfully orchestrated the French Revolution, had now dispatched its agents to America with the aim of subverting its government and eradicating Christianity. Morse's accusations were not vague. He pointed directly at the democratic Republican societies, which had formed in support of Jeffersonian ideals. He framed these political clubs as the American equivalent of the Jacobin clubs, arguing they were the secret instruments through which Weishaupt's diabolical plan was being executed on American soil. Morse's sermon ignited a brief but intense moral panic, particularly throughout New England, which was the heartland of Federalist and Congregationalist power. Other ministers and Federalist-aligned newspapers quickly amplified his message, creating a firestorm of accusations. The Illuminati scare became a powerful political weapon, allowing Federalists to paint their opponents not merely as political adversaries, but as treasonous agents of a foreign atheistic conspiracy. This hysteria provided a convenient justification for the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which granted the government sweeping powers to deport foreigners and prosecute citizens who criticized the administration. The panic ultimately fizzled due to a complete lack of evidence. When pressed, Morse and his allies could not produce a single piece of credible proof of Illuminati lodges operating in the United States. Even George Washington was compelled to weigh in, stating in a letter that while he believed the Illuminati's doctrines were pernicious, he did not think they had infected American Masonic lodges. Though the immediate scare passed, the episode successfully embedded the Illuminati myth into the DNA of American conspiratorial thinking, where it would lie dormant before re-emerging in later generations. The spark, ignited by Jedediah Morse's sermon in the spring of 1798, quickly burst into the full-fledged political firestorm known as the American Illuminati Panic. This was not a general fear of a vague foreign influence, but a targeted and deeply personal attack aimed at the highest levels of the Democratic Republican Party, with Thomas Jefferson as its ultimate target. For the Federalist clergy of New England, Jefferson embodied the very spirit of the Illuminati's perceived threat. His well-known deism, his scientific rationalism, his intellectual correspondence with French philosophers, and his sympathy for the French Revolution were not seen as elements of a complex worldview, but as a checklist of conspiratorial proof. He was, in their eyes, the would-be Weishaupt of the New World. The panic was propagated from the pulpits and presses of New England, the epicenter of Federalist power. Prominent ministers like Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale College, joined Morse in painting a lurid picture of an America on the brink of moral and political collapse. In a widely circulated sermon, Dwight warned that if the Jeffersonians came to power, the Bible would be burned, churches would be converted into temples of reason, and the nation would be subjected to the same atheistic terror that had consumed France. The rhetoric was explicit. A vote for Jefferson was a vote for the Illuminati, a vote for the complete destruction of the American experiment. This campaign weaponized the Illuminati myth to explain and demonize the rise of Jeffersonian democracy. The Democratic Republican societies, which promoted free speech and political organization, were cast as front organizations for Weishaupt's secret lodges, working to undermine the government from within. Newspapers aligned with the Federalist cause published sensationalist articles, often mixing factual reports of European events with wild speculation about secret agents and hidden plots operating in American cities. The goal was to create an atmosphere of profound distrust, framing legitimate political opposition as a seditious, foreign-directed conspiracy. The accusations, however, grew so extreme that they began to strain credulity. The Federalists failed to produce any concrete evidence linking Jefferson or his supporters to the defunct Bavarian order. The Democratic-Republican press responded with fierce counterattacks, portraying the panic as a desperate and cynical ploy by a declining political party to silence its opponents and maintain power. They argued that the true conspiracy was not from the Illuminati, but from the Federalists themselves, who were using fear to justify the unconstitutional Alien and Sedition Acts and suppress American liberties. The panic, which had burned so brightly for a few months in 1798 and 1799, ultimately exhausted itself. The American public, while wary of foreign entanglements, proved resistant to a conspiracy theory that lacked any tangible proof. The hysteria backfired on the Federalists, contributing to their image as paranoid elitists and helping to fuel Jefferson's decisive victory in the presidential election of 1800, an event the panic was specifically designed to prevent. While the sermons of Jedediah Morse and Timothy Dwight fueled the flames of the Illuminati panic, their accusations did not go unanswered. A significant and vocal opposition emerged, composed of clergymen, politicians, and journalists who methodically dismantled the conspiracy theory, exposing it as a politically motivated fabrication devoid of evidence. These voices of reason were crucial in preventing the hysteria from consuming the young republic. One of the most effective counter-arguments came from the press, particularly from newspapers aligned with the Democratic-Republican Party. Editors relentlessly highlighted the complete absence of proof for the Federalists' claims. They repeatedly challenged Morse and his allies to produce a single piece of evidence, a name, a letter, a lodge minute that could substantiate the existence of an Illuminati plot on American soil. When no such evidence was forthcoming, they framed the entire panic as an attack not on a secret society, but on the principles of free speech and political association. Several prominent Masons also stepped forward to defend their fraternity from the accusations. They argued that Robertson and Barrowall had fundamentally misunderstood and misrepresented the nature of Freemasonry, conflating the actions of a small, defunct German order with a global institution that preached morality, charity, and civic duty. They explained that Masonic lodges were independent bodies, not subject to the command of a central foreign authority, as the conspiracy alleged. The Grand Lodge of Massachusetts published a formal address to the public, firmly denying any connection to the Illuminati and reaffirming its members' loyalty to the United States and its Constitution. This defense from within the Masonic community provided a credible rebuttal to the sensationalist claims being made from the pulpit. Even within the clergy, there were voices of skepticism. Reverend William Bentley of Salem, a respected intellectual and Jeffersonian sympathizer, used his pulpit to denounce the panic. He argued that the conspiracy theories were a product of European monarchical propaganda, designed to discredit republicanism by associating it with atheism and chaos. Bentley contended that importing this hysteria into America was a disservice to both religion and rational inquiry, and he accused his fellow ministers of abandoning theological principle in favor of partisan political attacks. His reasoned sermons provided a crucial counter-narrative from a source of religious authority, demonstrating that not all of New England's clergy had succumbed to the panic. Ultimately, these collective counter-arguments successfully reframed the public debate. They shifted the focus from the imagined threat of a secret society to the real threat of political persecution and the suppression of dissent, helping to extinguish the moral panic of 1798. Following the brief but intense panic of 1798, the Illuminati myth did not vanish, but instead entered a long period of mutation and adaptation throughout the 19th century. Having lost its immediate political utility, the legend receded from mainstream discourse, becoming a persistent undercurrent in the world of esoteric and conspiratorial thought. Its first significant resurgence occurred during the American anti-Masonic movement of the 1820s and 1830s. Although this new wave of panic was primarily directed at the Freemasons, the older Illuminati narrative provided a ready-made template for a secret, hierarchical society accused of subverting Republican and Christian values. Anti-Masonic writers frequently invoked Robeson and Barruel, arguing that American Masonry was merely the public face of a deeper, more sinister Illuminati plot. In Europe, the wave of revolutions that swept across the continent in 1848 provided another catalyst for the myth's revival. Just as the French Revolution had done decades earlier, the widespread and seemingly coordinated uprisings led conservative thinkers to search for a hidden orchestrator. The Illuminati, with its established reputation as a fomenter of rebellion, was once again identified as the prime culprit. However, a crucial transformation was occurring. The focus of the conspiracy began to shift from the subversion of thrones and altars by radical philosophers to the manipulation of nations by a new, more powerful force: international finance. This evolution marked the legend's sinister fusion with modern anti-Semitic tropes. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the abstract idea of a secret society was increasingly projected onto prominent Jewish banking families, most notably the Rothschilds. In anti-Semitic literature of the period, the Illuminati became a useful narrative device, a secular-seeming front for what was alleged to be a Jewish plot for global domination. The structure of Weishaupt's order, with its secret cells, influential members, and grand ambition, was repurposed to describe a supposed cabal of financiers manipulating markets and governments from the shadows. By the end of the century, the name Illuminati had been largely stripped of its specific historical connection to Adam Weishaupt and Bavaria. It had become a generic, almost archetypal term for any clandestine elite believed to be pulling the strings of history, a potent symbol that would be inherited and radically reshaped by the conspiracy theorists of the 20th century. The 19th century evolution of the Illuminati myth into a symbol for any powerful clandestine group set the stage for its most ambitious reinvention, its insertion into a fabricated lineage stretching back to the Crusades. To give the conspiracy a sense of ancient legitimacy, later esoteric writers and conspiracists began to forge a historical chain connecting Adam Weishaupt's order to the legendary Knights Templar. This was an entirely posthumous creation, a grand narrative woven long after the historical Illuminati had ceased to exist, yet it would prove to be one of the most enduring elements of the modern mythos. The foundation for this connection was laid within 18th century Freemasonry itself. Following the brutal suppression of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century, a powerful legend emerged that a remnant of the order had survived in secret, particularly in Scotland, and had preserved its esoteric knowledge. High-degree Masonic rites, such as the Scottish Rite, began to incorporate Templar themes and titles, with some lodges even claiming to be the direct inheritors of the Templar tradition. This pre-existing Masonic fascination with Templarism provided the crucial link for later conspiracy theorists. They took this symbolic connection and presented it as a literal, unbroken chain of command. In this new, sprawling narrative, the Illuminati were not an invention of the Enlightenment, but merely the latest manifestation of a centuries-old conspiracy. The story contended that the Knights Templar, during their time in the Holy Land, had been initiated into the secrets of an even older Gnostic or mystical tradition. When the order was officially destroyed, its highest initiates allegedly went underground, carrying this secret doctrine with them. According to this theory, these fugitive Templars infiltrated the stonemason guilds of Europe, which would eventually evolve into modern Freemasonry. Through the centuries, this secret knowledge was passed down through a succession of societies. The Rosicrucians were often cited as another key link in the chain, until the time was right to launch a new, more public phase of the ancient plan. Adam Weishaupt, therefore, was not a founder but a chosen instrument, tasked by his own secret Masonic superiors with creating the Bavarian Illuminati to execute the final stage of the Templar agenda, the overthrow of all monarchies and religious institutions to establish a secular world government. This grand, unified conspiracy theory had no basis in the historical records of Weishaupt's order, which show no evidence of any connection to or interest in Templarism. It was a 19th century invention, a product of the occult revival's desire to create a single, hidden history of the world. After the political fires of the late 18th century died down, the Illuminati legend began a slow but profound metamorphosis. The initial conspiracy theory, born of counter-revolutionary fear, had been almost entirely political in nature, casting the order as a cabal of atheistic subversives aiming to dismantle thrones and altars. But as the 19th century progressed, this purely political phantom was captured and remolded by the burgeoning esoteric and occult revival movements sweeping across Europe and America. This transition shifted the Illuminati from the realm of political sedition into the domain of mystical legend, imbuing it with a power that was no longer just revolutionary, but deeply magical. The intellectual climate of the early 1800s saw a rising fascination with spiritualism, ancient wisdom, and secret mystical traditions. Thinkers like Eliphas Lévy in France began to synthesize a new vision of occult history, one in which all secret societies were merely different branches of a single ancient stream of hidden knowledge. In this new context, the Illuminati could no longer be seen as a simple creation of the Enlightenment. Instead, esotericists reinterpreted the order as a society of true illuminated ones. Not just in the rational sense that Weishaupt intended, but in a spiritual Gnostic sense. They were recast as adepts who had inherited a secret doctrine, a primordial wisdom that granted its possessors profound insight and power. This transformation was not accidental. It was a deliberate act of historical revisionism. The order's original secular goals of promoting reason and natural rights were either ignored or reinterpreted as exoteric blinds, a public-facing mission that concealed a deeper esoteric purpose. The Illuminati's secrecy, which had been a practical necessity for a subversive political club, was now seen as the hallmark of a genuine mystery school guarding its powerful secrets from the unworthy. This reimagining allowed the legend to absorb the mystical allure of Rosicrucianism and the perceived Gnostic heresies of the ancient world. Adam Weishaupt was no longer just a disgruntled law professor. He became an initiate, a hierophant in a long line of hidden masters. By the mid-19th century, the Illuminati of Barruel and Robison was almost unrecognizable. The political tool used to explain revolution had become an esoteric legend, a key component in a new occult worldview that would carry the myth into the modern era. The turn of the 20th century witnessed the culmination of the 19th century trend of merging secret society conspiracies with anti-Semitism. This process reached its most toxic and influential form in a document known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. First appearing in the Russian Empire around 1903, the text was a fabricated work of political propaganda, a forgery created by the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, to bolster the regime by blaming Jewish people for the country's social and political turmoil. While the protocols did not name the Illuminati, its entire structure was a direct inheritance of the conspiratorial framework established a century earlier by Augustin Barruel and John Robison. The document took the blueprint of the Illuminati plot, a secret cabal with a detailed plan for world domination, and repurposed it for a singular, malevolent goal: to incite hatred against Jews. The Protocols presented itself as the minutes from a secret meeting of Jewish leaders, outlining a step-by-step plan to achieve global control. The parallels to the alleged Illuminati conspiracy were precise and deliberate. Where the Illuminati supposedly sought to use reason and liberalism to subvert monarchies, the Elders of Zion were depicted using financial control and the manipulation of liberal ideas to achieve the same end. The text described a secret international council, a direct echo of Weishaupt's Areopagites. It detailed a plan to corrupt Gentile society, promote discord, and install a new world government, mirroring the exact accusations leveled against the Bavarian order. The forgery was, in essence, the Illuminati conspiracy theory stripped of its Bavarian origins and given a new, specific, and ethnically defined villain. Historical analysis has proven conclusively that the text is not only a forgery, but also a work of plagiarism. Large sections were lifted almost verbatim from Maurice Joly's 1864 political satire. The Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, a work that had nothing to do with Jewish people and was intended as a critique of Napoleon III. The forgers simply substituted the Jews for Joly's original conspirators. The protocols represented the final, grim stage in the evolution of the 19th century myth. It took the now established narrative of a powerful secret society working to overthrow civilization and attached it permanently to the most persistent scapegoat of European history. This act would have catastrophic consequences, providing ideological justification for pogroms and, later, the Holocaust, by cementing the link between the idea of a secret global plot and anti-Semitic hatred. While the Illuminati myth was being weaponized for political and anti-Semitic purposes, a parallel transformation was occurring within the esoteric subcultures of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The occult revival, a widespread intellectual movement fascinated with mysticism, ancient wisdom, and secret spiritual hierarchies, seized upon the legend and repurposed it. In their hands, the Illuminati were stripped of their purely political context and recast as players in a cosmic, mystical drama. This reinterpretation was essential for the myth's modern survival, adding layers of esoteric meaning that would prove deeply influential. A central force in this process was the Theosophical Society, founded in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky. Theosophy proposed a grand, syncretic history of religion, positing that all faiths stemmed from a single ancient wisdom religion preserved and transmitted through the ages by a secret brotherhood of spiritual masters. Within this framework, the Bavarian Illuminati were re-evaluated. They were no longer seen as atheistic revolutionaries, but as a historical, albeit perhaps misguided, manifestation of this hidden hierarchy's efforts to guide humanity. Theosophical writers presented Weishaupt's order as a failed attempt to bring esoteric enlightenment to the masses, an imperfect channel for the true spiritual illumination that only the masters possessed. This reframing absorbed the Illuminati into a vast, mystical lineage, connecting them to Atlantis, ancient Egypt, and the sages of the Himalayas. This esoteric reinvention was taken to a new level in the early 20th century by the English occultist Aleister Crowley. A master of self-promotion and magical syncretism, Crowley saw himself as the prophet of a new age and the inheritor of all past magical traditions. He was fascinated by the structure and ambition of the Illuminati, and in his role as head of the magical order Ordo Templi Orientis, or OTO, he deliberately co-opted the name. Crowley incorporated the title of Illuminati into the highest degrees of the OTO, redefining the term not as rational enlightenment, but as the attainment of supreme spiritual and magical consciousness, in line with his philosophy of Thelema. For Crowley, the historical order was a precursor, a flawed rationalist experiment, while his order represented its true magical fulfillment. Through these occult reinterpretations, the Illuminati legend was permanently altered, acquiring a mystical dimension that ensured its continued relevance long after the political fears that birthed it had faded. Following the esoteric reimaginings and political co-optations of the early 20th century, the legend of the Illuminati entered a prolonged period of relative obscurity. For much of the mid-20th century, from the 1930s through the 1950s, the once potent myth largely receded from mainstream public consciousness. The grand conspiracy that had been used to explain the French Revolution and had terrified the early American Republic became a historical footnote, a subject confined to the specialized interests of academic historians and the isolated corners of fringe political thought. The global stage was now dominated by new, more tangible anxieties: the rise of fascism, the devastation of a Second World War, and the stark bipolar division of the Cold War. These events provided new villains and more immediate, state-sponsored conspiracies that captured the public imagination in a way the ghostly Illuminati no longer could. Within academic circles, the historical Bavarian Illuminati was treated as a settled matter, a fascinating but ultimately failed Enlightenment experiment that existed for less than a decade. Historians had access to the original seized documents and understood the order's true aims and its swift dissolution. The conspiracy theories of Barrow and Robertson were studied as historical artifacts themselves, examples of counter-revolutionary panic, rather than as credible accounts of reality. Outside of these scholarly contexts, the myth survived only in specific, insulated subcultures. Certain far-right and anti-Semitic groups, particularly in the United States, continued to circulate pamphlets that wove the Illuminati into a grand narrative of global control, often linking them to international banking or the supposed threat of communism. However, these theories lacked a broad audience, their reach limited by the pre-digital media landscape. The name Illuminati was no longer a common boogeyman invoked to explain world events. The immediate and visceral threat of Soviet espionage and nuclear annihilation provided a far more compelling narrative of a clandestine global struggle. The world did not need an 18th century ghost to explain its troubles when it had the very real and present danger of the KGB and the atomic bomb. The legend, having lost its immediate political utility and cultural resonance, lay dormant. It was a reference known to a few, a piece of historical trivia for some, and a fringe belief for others, quietly waiting in dusty library stacks and obscure pamphlets for a cultural moment that would allow its reinvention.